Chapter 12 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista, Zaleski. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 12. Thebes? Echoed Parthenia Ann Hawks, widow. The stiff crape of her weeds seemed to bristle. I'll do nothing of the kind, miss. If you and that fine husband of yours think to rid yourself of me that way. But, Mamma, we're not trying to rid ourselves of you. How can you think of such things? You've always said you hated the boat. Always. And now that you needn't stay with the show any longer, I thought you'd want to go back to Thebes to live. Indeed. And what's to become of the cotton blossom? Tell me that, Maggie Hawks. I don't know, confessed Magnolia miserably. I don't know. That's what I think we ought to talk about. The cotton blossom, after her tragic encounter with the hidden snag in the Mississippi, was in for repairs. The damage to the showboat had been greater than they had thought. The snag had, after all, inflicted a jagged wound. So, too, had it torn and wounded something deep and hidden in Magnolia's soul. Suddenly she had a horror of the great river whose treacherous secret fangs had struck so poisonously. The sight of the yellow, turbid flood sickened her, yet held her hypnotized. Now she thought that she must run from it, with her husband and her child, to safety. Now she knew that she never could be content away from it. She wanted to flee. She longed to stay. This, if ever, was her chance. But the river had Captain Andy. Somewhere in its secret coils he lay. She could not leave him. On the rivers, the three great mysteries, love and birth and death, had been revealed to her. All that she had known of happiness and tragedy, and tranquility and adventure and romance and fulfillment, was bound up in the rivers. Their willow-fringed banks framed her world. The motley figures that went up and down upon them, or that dwelt on their shores, were her people. She knew them, was of them. The Mississippi had her, as surely as it had little Andy Hawks. "Well, we're talking about it, ain't we?" Mrs. Hawks now demanded. "I mean, the repairs are going to be quite expensive. She'll be laid up for a month or more, right in the season. Now's the time to decide whether we're going to try to run her ourselves, just as if Papa were still. I can see you've been talking things over pretty hard and fast with Ravenal. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do, miss. We're going to run her ourselves. Leastways, I am." "But, Mamma!" "Your Papa left no will. Hawks all over. I've as much say-so as you have. More. I'm his widow. You won't see me willing to throw away the goodwill of a business that's taken years to build up. The boat's insurance will take care of the repairs. Your Pa's life insurance is paid up, and quite a decent sum, for him. I saw to that. You'll get your share, I'll get mine. The boat goes on like it always has. No Thebes for me. You'll go on playing ingenue leads. Ravenel juvenile. Kim—" "No!" cried Magnolia, much as Parthy had years before. "Not Kim!" "Why not?" There was about the widow Hawks a terrifying and invincible energy. Her black habiliments of woe billowed about her like the sable wings of a destroying angel. With Captain Andy gone, she would appoint herself commander of the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theatre. Magnolia knew that. Who, knowing Parthy, could imagine it otherwise? She would appoint herself commander of their lives. Magnolia was no weakling. She was a woman of metal. But no metal could withstand the sledgehammer blows of Parthy Ann Hawks' iron. It was impossible that such an arrangement could hold. From the first, Ravenel rejected it. But Magnolia's pleadings for at least a trial won him over, but grudgingly. "It won't work, Nola, I tell you. We'll be at each other's throats. She's got all kinds of plans. I can see them whirling around in her eye. But you will try to be patient, won't you, Gay, for my sake and Kim's?" But they had not been out a week before mutiny struck the Cotton Blossom. The first to go was Windy. Once his great feet were set toward the gangplank, there was no stopping him. He was over 70 now, but he looked not an hour older than when he had come aboard the Cotton Blossom almost 15 years before. To the irate widow he spoke briefly but with finality. "You're Hawks's widow. That's why I said I'd take her same's if Andy was alive. I thought Nolly's husband would boss this boat, but seems you're running it. Well, ma'am, I ain't no petticoat pilot. I'm off the end of this trip down. Young Tanner'll come aboard there and pilot you." "Tanner? Who's he?" "How'd you know I want him? I'm running this boat." "You better take him, Mrs. Hawks, ma'am. He's young, not set in his ways, and likely won't mind your nagging. I'm too old. Lost my taste for the rivers, anyway, since Cap went. Lost my nerve, too, seems like. Well, ma'am, I'm going." And he went. Changes came then, tripping on each other's heels. Miss Means stayed, and little weak-chested Mr. Means. Frank had gone after Magnolia's marriage. Ralph left. Parthy met these difficulties and defeats with magnificent generalship. She seemed actually to thrive on them. Do this, do that. Ravenel's right eyebrow was cocked in a perpetual circumflex of disdain. One could feel the impact of opposition whenever the two came together. Every fibre of Ravenel's silent, secretive nature was taut in rejection of this managerial mother-in-law. Every nerve and muscle of that energetic female's frame tingled with enmity toward this suave, soft-spoken, contemptuous husband of her daughter. Finally, "Choose," said Gaylord Ravenel, "between your mother and me." Magnolia chose. Her decision met with such terrific opposition from Parthy as would have shaken any woman less determined and less in love. "Where are you going with that fine husband of yours? Tell me that." "I don't know." "I'll warrant you don't. No more does he. Why are you going? You've got a good home on the boat." "Kim, school." "Fiddlesticks." Magnolia took the plunge. I'm not. Gay's not happy any more on the rivers." "You'll be a sight unhappier on land before you're through. Make no mistake about that, young lady. Where'll you go? Chicago, What'll you do there? Starve and worse. I know. Many's the time you'll wish yourself back here." Magnolia, nervous, apprehensive, torn, now burst into sudden rebellion against the iron hand that had gripped her all these years. "How do you know? How can you be so sure? And even if you are right, what of it? You're always trying to keep people from doing the things they want. You're always wanting people to live cautiously. You fought to keep Papa from buying the cotton blossom in the first place, and made his life a hell, and now you won't leave it. You didn't want me to act. You didn't want me to marry Gay. You didn't want me to have Kim. Maybe you were right. Maybe I shouldn't have done any of those things. But how do you know? You can't twist people's lives around like that, even if you twist them right. Because how do you know that even when you're right, you mayn't be wrong? If Papa had listened to you, we'd be living in Thebes. He'd be alive, probably. I'd be married to the butcher, maybe. You can't do it. Even God lets people have their own way, though they have to fall down and break their necks to find out they were wrong. You can't do it, and you're glad when it turns out badly." She was growing incoherent. Back of Parthy's opposition to their going was a deep relief of which even she was unaware, and whose existence she would have denied had she been informed of it. Her business talent, so long dormant, was leaping into life. Her energy was cataclysmic. One would almost have said she was happy. She discharged actors, crew, engaged actors, crew, ordered supplies, spoke of shifting to an entirely new territory the following year, perhaps to the rivers of North Carolina and Maryland. She actually did this, though not until much later. Magnolia, years afterward reading her mother's terse and maddening letters, would be seized with a nostalgia not for the writer, but for the lovely-sounding places of which she wrote, though they probably were as barren and unpicturesque as the river towns of the Mississippi and Ohio and Big Sandy and Kanawha. "We're playing the town of Bath on the Pamlico River," Parthy's letter would say, or "We had a good week at Queenstown on the Sassafras." Magnolia, looking out onto the gray Chicago streets, slippery with black ice, thick with the Lake Michigan fog, would repeat the names over to herself. Bath on the Pamlico, Queenstown on the Sassafras. Mrs. Hawks, at parting, was all for Magnolia's retaining her financial share in the cotton blossom, the money accruing therefrom to be paid at regular intervals. In this she was right. She knew Ravenel. In her hard and managing way she loved her daughter, wished to ensure her best interests. But Magnolia and Ravenel preferred to sell their share outright if she would buy. Ravenel would probably invest it in some business, Magnolia said. "Yes, monkey business," retorted Mrs. Hawks, then added earnestly, Now mind, don't you come snivelling to me when it's gone, and you and your children haven't a penny to bless yourselves with. For that's what it'll come to in the end, mark my words. I don't say I wouldn't be happy to see you and Kim back, but not him. When he's run through every penny of your money, he needn't look to me for more. You can come back to the boat, you and Kim. I'll look for you, but him, never." The two women faced each other, and they were no longer mother and daughter, but two forces opposing each other with all the strength that lay in the deep and powerful nature of both. Magnolia made one of those fine speeches. "I wouldn't come to you for help, not if I were starving to death, and Kim too." "Oh, there's worse things than starving to death." "I wouldn't come to you no matter what." "You will, just the same. I'd take my oath on that." "I never will." Secretly, she was filled with terror at leaving the rivers. For the rivers, and the little inaccessible river towns, and the indolent and naive people of those towns whose very presence in them confessed their failures, had with the years taken on in Magnolia's eyes the friendly aspect of the accustomed. Here was comfort assured. Here were friends. Here the ease that goes with familiarity. Even her mother's bristling generalship had it in a protective quality. The very showboat was a second mother, shielding her from the problems and cares that beset the land dweller. The cotton blossom had been a little world in itself, on which life was a thing detached, dreamlike, narcotic. As Magnolia Ravenal, with her husband and her child, turned from this existence of ease to the outside world of which she already had had one bitter taste, she was beset by hordes of fears and doubts. Yet opposing these, and all but vanquishing them, was the strong love of adventure, the eager curiosity about the unknown, which had always characterized her and her dead father, the little captain, and caused them both to triumph thus far over the clutching, cautious admonitions of Parthenia Ann Hawks. Fright and anticipation, nostalgia and curiosity, a soaring sense of freedom at leaving her mother's too protective wing, a pang of compunction that she should feel this unfilial surge of relief. They were going. You saw the three of them scrambling up the steep river bank to the levee, perhaps for the last time, Magnolia thought with a great pang. And within herself a voice cried, "No, no!" Ravenal, slim, cool, contained. Magnolia whiter than usual, and frankly tearful. The child Kim waving an insouciant farewell with both small fists. They carried no bundles, no parcels, no valises. Ravenal disdained to carry parcels. He did not permit those of his party to carry them. Two Negroes in tattered and faded blue overalls made much of the luggage, stowing it inefficiently under the seats and over the floor of the livery rig, which had been hired to take the three to the nearest railway station, a good 12 miles distant. The Cotton Blossom troop was grouped on the forward deck to see them off. The Cotton Blossom lay, smug, safe, plump at the water's edge. A passing side-wheeler, flopping ponderously downstream, sent little flirty waves across the calm waters to her, and set her to palpitating coyly. "Goodbye, goodbye! Right now!" Miss Mean's face distorted in a ridiculous pucker of woe. Ravenal in the front seat with the driver. Magnolia and Kim in the back seat with the luggage protruding at uncomfortable angles all about them. Parthenia Ann Hawks, the better to see them, had stationed herself on the little protruding upper deck forward, the deck that resembled a balcony, much like that on the old Cotton Blossom. The livery nags started with a lurch up the dusty village street. They clattered across the bridge toward the upper road. Magnolia turned for a last glimpse through her tears. There stood Parthenia Ann Hawks, silhouetted against sky and water, a massive and almost menacing figure in her robes of black, tall, erect, indomitable. Her face was set. The keen eyes gazed, unblinking, across the sunlit waters. One arm was raised in a gesture of farewell. Ruthless, unconquerable, headstrong, untamed, terrible. "She's like the river," Magnolia thought through her grief, in a sudden flash of vision. "She's the one, after all, who's like the Mississippi." A bend in the upper road, a clump of sycamores, the river, the showboat, the silent black-robed figure were lost to view. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by FloraMetrick, Bonita Springs, Florida. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 13. The most casual onlooker could gauge the fluctuations of the Ravenal fortunes by any one of three signs. There was Magnolia Ravenel's sealskin sack. There was Magnolia Ravenel's diamond ring. There was Gaylord Ravenel's Malacca cane. Any or all of these had a way of vanishing and reappearing in a manner that would have been baffling to one not an habitué of South Clark Street, Chicago. Of the three, the Malacca stick, though of most no tangible value, disappeared first and oftenest, for it came to be recognized as an IOU by every reputable Clark Street pawnbroker. Deep in a losing game of faro at Jeff Hankins or Mike McDonald's, Ravenel would summon a Negro boy to him. He would hand him the little ivory-topped cane. Here, take this down to Abe Lipman's corner, Clark and Monroe. Tell him I want $200. Hurry. Or run over to Goldsmith's with this. Tell him $100. The black boy would understand. In 10 minutes he would return minus the stick and bearing a wilted sheaf of $10 bills. If Ravenel's luck turned, the cane was redeemed. If it still stayed stubborn, the diamond ring must go. That failing, then the sealskin sack. Ravenel, contrary to the custom of his confrère, wore no jewelry, possessed none. There were certain sinister aspects of these outward signs, as when, for example, the reigning sealskin sack was known to skip an entire winter. Perhaps none of these symbols was as significant a betrayal of the Ravenel finances as was Gay Ravenel's choice of a breakfasting place. He almost never breakfasted at home. This was a reversion to one of the habits of his bachelor days. Was doubtless a tardy rebellion, too, against the years spent under Mrs. Hawks' harsh regime. He always had hated those cotton blossom 9 o'clock family breakfasts ominously presided over by Parthy in cap and curler papers. Since their coming to Chicago, Gay liked to breakfast between 11 and 12, and certainly never rose before 10. If the Ravenel luck was high, the meal was eaten in a leisurely luxury at Billy Boyle's Chop House between Clark and Dearborn Streets. This was most agreeable, for at Billy Boyle's during the noon hour you encountered Chicago's sporting blood, political overlords, gamblers, jockeys, actors, reporters. These last mere nobodies, lean and somewhat morose young fellows vaguely known as George Ade, Brand Whitlock, John McCutcheon, Pete Dunn. Here the news and gossip of the day went round. Here you saw the Prince Albert coat, the silk hat, the rattling cuffs, the glimmering collar, the diamond stud of the professional gamester. Old Carter Harrison, mayor of Chicago, would drop in daily, a good 25-cent cigar waggling between his lips as he greeted his friend and that. In came the brokers from the Board of Trade across the way. Smoke blue air, the rich, heavy smell of thick steaks cut from prime Western beef, massive glasses of beer through which shone the pale amber of light brew, or the seal brown of dark. The scent of strong black coffee, rye bread pungent with caraway, little crisp brown breakfast rolls sprinkled with poppy seed. Calories, high blood pressure, vegetable luncheons, golf were words not yet included in the American everyday vocabulary. Fried potatoes were still considered a breakfast dish, and meatless meal was a snack. Here it was, then, that Gay Ravenel, slim, pale, quiet, elegant, liked best to begin his day, listening charmingly and attentively to the talk that swirled about him, talk of yesterday's lucky winners in Gambler's Alley, at Prince Varnell's place, or Jeff Hankins, or Mike McDonald's, of the Washington Park racetrack entries, of the new blonde girl at Hetty Chilson's, of politics in their simplest terms. Occasionally he took part in this talk, but like most professional gamblers, His was not the conversational gift. He was given credit for the astuteness he did not possess merely on the strength of his cool, evasive glance, his habit of listening and saying little, and his bland poker face. Ravenel doesn't say much, but there's damn little he misses. Watch him an hour straight and you can't make out from his face whether he's cleaning up 1,000 or losing his shirt. An enviable Clark Street reputation. Still, this availed him nothing when funds were low. At such times he eschewed Billy Boyle's and breakfasted meagerly instead of the cockeyed bakery just east of Clark. That famous refuge for the temporarily insolvent was so named because of the optical peculiarity of the lady who owned it and who dispensed its coffee and sinkers. This refreshment cost 10 cents. The coffee was hot, strong, revivifying. The sinkers crisp and fresh. Every Clark Street gambler was, at one time or another, through the vagaries of Lady Luck, to be found moodily munching the plain fare that made up the limited menu to be had at the cockeyed bakery. For that matter, lacking even the modest sum required for this sustenance, he knew that there he would be allowed to throw up a tab until luck should return. Many a morning, Gaylord Ravenel, dapper, nonchalant, sartorially exquisite, fared forth at 11 with but 50 cents in the pocket of his excellently tailored pants. Usually on these occasions, the Malacca stick was significantly absent. Of the 50 cents, 10 went for the glassy shoe shine, 25 for a boutonniere, 10 for coffee and sinkers at the cockeyed bakery. The remaining 5 cents stayed in his pocket as a sop to the superstition that no coin breeds no more coins. Stopping first to look in a moment at Weeping Willow's Manglers or at Riley's pool room for a glance at the racing chart or to hear a bit of the talk missed through his enforced absence from Boyle's, he would end at Hankins or McDonald's, there to woo fortune with nothing at all to offer as oblation. But affairs did not reach this pass until after the first year. It was incredible that Magnolia Ravenel could so soon have adapted herself to the life in which she now moved. Yet it was explicable, perhaps, when one took into consideration her inclusive nature. She was interested, alert, eager, and still in love with Gaylord Ravenel. Her life on the rivers had accustomed her to all that was bizarre in humanity. Queenie and Joe had been much a part of her existence as Ellie and Schultze, the housewives in the little towns, the Negroes lounging on the wharves, the gamblers in the riverfront saloons, the miners of the coal belt, the northern fruit pickers, the boatmen, the southern poor whites, the Louisiana aristocracy, all had passed in fantastic parade before her ambient eyes. And she too had marched in a parade, a figure as gorgeous, as colorful as the rest. Now, in this new life, she accepted everything, enjoyed everything with a naivete that was perhaps her greatest charm. It was doubtless the thing that held the roving Ravenel to her. Nothing shocked her. This was her singularly pure and open mind. She brought to this new life an interest and a curiosity as fresh as that which had characterized the little girl who had so eagerly and companionably sat with Mr. Pepper, the pilot, in the bright, cozy, glass-enclosed pilot house atop the old Creole Belle on that first enchanting trip down the Mississippi to New Orleans. To him she had said, "What's around the bend? Now what's coming? How deep is it here? What used to be there? What island is that?" Mr. Pepper, the pilot, had answered her questions amply and with a feeling of satisfaction to himself as he beheld her childish hunger for knowledge being appeased. Now she said to her husband with equal eagerness, "Who is that stout woman with the pretty yellow-haired girl? What queer eyes they have! What does it mean when it says odds are 2 to 1? Why do they call him Bathhouse John? Who is that large woman in the Victoria with the lovely sunshade? How rich her dress is, yet it's plain. Why don't you introduce me to, Hetty Chilson. Why do they call him Bad Jimmy Connerton? But why do they call it the Levee? It's really Clark Street, and no water anywhere near, so why do they call it the Levee? What's a percentage game? Hieronymus. What's a funny word? Mike McDonald, that. Why, he looks like a farmer, doesn't he? A farmer in his Sunday best black clothes that don't fit him. The boss of the gamblers. Why do they call this place the store? Oh, Gay darling, I wish you wouldn't. Now don't frown like that. When I think of Kim, I get scared because how about Kim? When she grows up. Why are they called owl ears? But I don't understand why Lipman lets you have money just for a cane that isn't worth more than 10 or 20. How do pawnbrokers? Montens. That's a queer name. Al Hankins. Oh, you're joking now, really. Killing by having a folding bed close up on him. Oh, I've never again sleep in a Boiler Avenue, Hooley's Theater, Cinca Valley, Fanny Davenport, Derby Day, Weber and Fields, Sauterne, Rectors. Quite another world about which to be curious. A world as sordid and colorful and crude and passionate and cruel and rich and varied as that other had been. It had taken Ravenel a little more than a year to dissipate the tidy fortune which had been Magnolia's share of Captain Andy's estate, including the cotton blossom interest. He had, of course, meant to double the sum, to multiply it many times so that the plump thousands should increase to tens, to hundreds of thousands. Once you had money, a really respectable amount of it, it was simple enough to manipulate that money so as to make it magically produce more and more money. They had made straight for Chicago, at that period the gambler's paradise. When Ravenel announced this step, a little look of panic had come into Magnolia's eyes. She was reluctant to demur at his plans. It was the thing her mother always had done when her father had proposed a new move. Always Captain Andy's enthusiasm had suffered the cold douche of Parthy's disapproval. At the prospect of Chicago, the old haunts, congenial companions, the restaurants, the theaters, the races, Ravenel had been more elated than she had ever seen him. He had become almost loquacious. He could even be charming to Mrs. Hawks, now that he was nearly free of her. That iron woman had regarded him as her enemy to the last, and in making over to Magnolia the goodish sum of money which was due her, had uttered dire predictions, all of which promptly came true. That first year in Chicago was a picture so kaleidoscope, so extravagant, so ridiculous, that even the child Kim retained in her memory's eye something of its color and pageantry. This father and mother in their 20s seemed really little older than their child. Certainly there was something pathetically childish in their evident belief that they could at once spend their money and keep it intact. Just a fur coat. What was that? Bonnets, a smart high yellow trap, horses, the races, suppers, a nursemaid for Kim. Magnolia knew nothing of money. She never had any. On the cotton blossom, money was a commodity of which one had little need. On coming to Chicago, they had gone directly to the Sherman House. Compared with this, that first visit to Chicago before Kim's birth had been a mere picnic jaunt. Ravenel was proud of his young wife and his quiet, grave, big-eyed child, of the nursemaid in a smart uniform, of the pair of English hackneys which he sometimes allowed Magnolia to drive, to her exquisite delight. Magnolia had her first real evening dress, cut décolleté, tested champagne, went to the races at the Washington Park racetrack, sat in a box at Hooley's, was horrified at witnessing the hoochie coochie dance on the Midway Plaisance at the World's Fair. The first fur coat was worthy of note. The wives of the well-to-do wore sealskin sacks as proof of their husbands' prosperity. Magnolia descended to these later, but the pelts which warmed her during the first winter of Chicago lake blasts and numbing cold had been cunningly matched in Paris. The French fingers had fashioned them into a wrap. Ravenel had selected it for her, of course. He always accompanied her on her shopping trips. He liked to loll elegantly at ease like a pasha, while the keen-eyed saleswoman brought out this gown and that for his expert inspection. To these alert ladies, it was plain to see that Magnolia knew little enough about chic attire. The gentleman, though, he knew what was what. Magnolia had been aghast at the cost of that first fur coat. But then, how could she know of such things? Between them, she and Parthy had made most of the costumes she had worn in her cotton blossom days, both for stage and private use. The new coat was a black Strachan jacket. The fur lay in large, smooth waves known as baby lamb. Magnolia said it made her feel like a cannibal to wear a thing like that. The salesladies did not smile at that, but that was all right because Magnolia had not intended that they should. The rivers and cuffs were of Russian sable, dark and rich and deep, and it had large mutton leg sleeves, large enough to contain her dress sleeves comfortably, with a little expert aid in the way of stuffing. "Stuff my sleeves in" was one of the directions always given a gentleman when he assisted a lady with her wrap. This royal garment had cost, "Oh, Gay," Magnolia had protested in a low, shocked voice, but not so low that the sharp-eyed saleswoman failed to hear it. "Oh, Gay, I honestly don't think we ought." "Mrs. Potter Palmer," spoke up the chief saleswoman in a voice at once sharp and suave, "has a coat identically similar. They are the only two of a kind in this whole country. To tell you the truth, I think the sable skins on this garment of Madam's are just a little finer than Mrs. Palmer's. Though perhaps it's just that Madam sets it off better, being so young and all." He liked her to wear, nestling in the rich depths of the sable rivers, a bunch of violets. For the theater she had one of those new winged bonnets, representing a butterfly, cunningly contrived of mousseline de soie, moire, and brilliantly spangled, so that it quivered and trembled with the movements of her head, and sparkled enchantingly. Kim adored the smell of the violet-scented creature, who kissed her good night and swept out, glittering. The impression must have gone deep, deep into the childish mind, for 20 years later she still retained a sort of storybook mental picture of this black-haired, creamy mother who would come in late of a winter afternoon, laughing and bright-eyed after a drive up Grand Boulevard in the sleigh behind the swift English hackneys. This vision would seem to fill the warm room with delightful mixture of violets and fur and cold fresh air and velvet and spangles and love and laughter. Kim would plunge her face deep into the soft scented bosom. "Oh, Gay, do see how she loves the violets. You won't mind if I take them off and put them here in this glass so she—" "No, you mustn't. Buy me any fresh ones, please. I wish I didn't look quite so much like me, her mouth, but it's going to be a great wide one like mine. Oh, Bernard, who wants a little girl to look like Bernard? Besides, Kim isn't going to be an actress." At the end of a year or so of this, money was gone, simply gone. Of course, it hadn't been only the hackneys and the races and the trap and the furs and the suppers and the theaters and dresses and Gay's fine garments and the nurse and the hotel. For, as Ravenel explained, the hackneys hadn't even been pure-blooded, which would have brought them up to 1,000 each. He had never been really happy about them because of a slight blot on their family escutcheon, which had brought them down to a mere 600 apiece. This flaw was apparent, surely, to no one who was not an accredited judge at a horse show. Yet, when Ravenel and Magnolia on Derby Day joined the gay stream of tally-hos, wagonettes, coaches, phaetons, tandems, cocking carts, and dog carts sweeping up Michigan Avenue and Grand Boulevard toward the Washington Park racetrack, he was likely to fall into one of his moody silences and to flick the hackneys with little contemptuous cuts of the long, lithe whip in a way that only they and Magnolia understood. On such occasions he called them nags. "Ah, that off-nag broke again. That's because they're not thoroughbreds." "But, Gay, you're hurting their mouths, sawing like that." "Please, Nola, this isn't a Mississippi barge I'm driving." She learned many things that first year, and saw so much that part of what she saw was mercifully soon forgotten. "You say Derby Day, very English. You pretended not to mind when your husband went down to speak to Hetty Chilson and her girls in their box. For that matter, you pretended not to see Hetty Chilson and her girls at all, though they had driven out a sort of private procession of Victorias, Landaus, Broughams, and were by far the best-dressed women at the races. They actually set the styles, Gay had told her. Hetty Chilson's girls wore rich, quiet, almost sedate clothes, and no paint on their faces. They seemed an accepted part of the world in which Gaylord Ravenel moved. Even in the rough life of the Rivers, Magnolia had always understood that women of Hetty Chilson's calling simply did not exist in the public sense. They were not of the substance of everyday life, but were shadows, sinister, menacing, evil. But with this new life of magnolias came the startling knowledge that these ladies played an important part in the social and political life of this huge, sprawling Midwestern city. This stout, blonde, rather handsome woman who carried herself with an air of prosperous assurance, whose shrewd, keen glance and hearty laugh rather attracted you. This one was Hetty Chilson, the horsewoman you saw riding in the Lincoln Park bridle path, handsomely habited in black, close-fitting riding clothes, were likely as not Hetty Chilson's girls. She was actually a power in her way. When strangers were shown places of interest in Chicago, the Potter Palmer Castle on Lakeshore Drive, the Art Museum, the Stockyards, the Auditorium Hotel, the great mansions of Phil Armour and his son on Michigan Avenue, with the garden embracing an entire city block, Hetty Chilson's place, too, was pointed out, with a lowering of the voice, of course, and a little leer, and perhaps an elbow dug into the ribs. A substantial brick house on Clark Street, near Polk, with 2 lions carved in stone, absurdly guarding its profane portals. Hetty Chilson's place, Gay explained to his wide-eyed young wife, is like a club. You're likely to find every prominent politician in Chicago there, smoking and having a sociable drink, and half the political plots that you read about in the newspapers later are hatched at Hetty's. She's as smart as they make 'em. Bought a farm, 15 acres, out on 19th and State for her father and mother, and she's got a country place out in the Kankakee River near Momence, about 60 miles south of here, that's known to have one of the finest libraries in the country. Cervantes, Balzac, rare editions, stable full of horses, rose garden. But Gay, dear, you saw Hetty driving down State Street during the shopping hour in her Kimball-made Victoria, an equipage such as royalty might have used. Its ebony body fashioned by master craftsmen, its enamel as rich and deep and shining as a piano top. Her ample skirts would be spread upon the plum-colored cushions. If it was summer, the lace ruffles of her sunshade would plume gently in the breeze. In winter, her mink coat swathed her full, firm figure. One of her girls sat beside her, faultlessly dressed, pale, unvivacious. 2 men in livery in the box, harness that shone with polished metal and jangled splendidly. 2 slim, quivering, high-stepping chestnuts, queen of her world, Chicago's underworld. But Gay, dear, well, how about France? France? How about the women you used to read about, learned about them in your history books, for that matter, at school? Pompadour and Maintenon and Du Barry. Didn't they mix up in the politics of their day, and weren't they recognized? Courtesans, every one of them. You think that because they wore white wigs and flowered silk hoops and patches. A little unaccustomed flush surged over Magnolia's pallor, the deep, almost painful red of indignation. She was an inexperienced woman, but she was no fool. These last few months had taught her many things. Also, the teachings of her schoolteacher mother had not, after all, been quite forgotten, it appeared. She's a common woman of the town, Gaylord Ravenel. All the wigs and patches and silks in the world won't make her anything else. She's no more a Du Barry than your hinky-dink is Mazzone. It was as though he took a sort of perverse pleasure in thus startling her. It wasn't that she was shocked in the prim sense of the word. She was bewildered and a little frightened. At such times the austere form and the grim visage of Parthenia and Hawks would rise up before her puzzled eyes. What would Parthi have said of these unsavory figures now passing a parade before Magnolia's confused vision? Hetty Chilson, Doc Haggerty, Mike McDonald, Prince Varnell, Effie Hankins. Uneasy though she was, Magnolia could manage to smile as the thought of her mother's verbal destruction of this raffish crew. There was no half-tones in Parthi's vocabulary. A hussy was a hussy, a rake, but her father, she thought, would have been interested in all this, and more than a little amused. His bright brown eyes would have missed nothing. The little nimble figure would have scampered inquisitively up and down the narrow and somewhat sinister lane that lay between Washington and Madison Streets, known as Gambler's Alley. He would have taken a turn at Faro, appraised the levee ladies at their worth, visited Sam T. Jack's burlesque show over on Madison, and Cole and Middleton's museum, probably, and Hooley's Theater, certainly. Nothing in Chicago's levee life would have escaped little Captain Andy, and nothing would have changed him. "See it all, Nolly," he had said to her in the old cotton blossom days, when Parthy would object to their taking this or that jaunt ashore between shows. "Don't you believe 'em when they say that what you don't know won't hurt you. Biggest lie ever was. See it all and go your own way, and nothing'll hurt you. If what you see ain't pretty, what's the odds? See it anyway. Then next time you don't have to look." Magnolia, gazing about her, decided she was seeing it all. The bulk of the money had gone at faro. The suckers played roulette, stud poker, hazard, the birdcage, chuck-a-luck, the old army game. But your gambler playing faro. Faro was Gaylord Ravenel's game, and he played at Hankins. Not at George Hankins, where they catered to the cheap trade who played percentage games, but at Jeff Hankins or Mike McDonald's, where were found the highest stakes in Chicago. Faro was not a game with Ravenel. It was for him at once his profession, his science, his drug, his drink, his mistress. He had, unhappily, as was so often the case with your confirmed gambler, no other vice. He rarely drank, and then abstemiously, smoked little and then a mild cigar, ate sparingly and fastidiously, eschewed even the diamond ring and shirt stud of his kind. The two did not, of course, watch the money go, or despair because it would soon be gone. There seemed to be plenty of it. There always would be enough. Next week would invest in securely. Ravenel had inside tips on the market. He had heard of a good thing. This was not the right time, but they would let him know when the magic moment was at hand. In the meantime, there was faro, and there was the luxurious hotel rooms with their soft, thick carpets and their big, comfortable beds. Ice water tinkling at the door in answer to your ring, special dishes to tempt and taste of Mr. Ravenel and his lady, the sharp-eyed gentleman in evening clothes who stood near the little ticket box as you entered the theater said, "Good evening, Mr. Ravenel," and they went to Hooley's or McVicker's, or the Grand Opera House, or Cole and Castle's. The heads of departments at Mandel's or Carson's, Peary, or even Marshall Field said, "I have something rather special to show you, Mrs. Ravenel. I thought of you the minute it came in." Sometimes it seemed to Magnolia that the Cotton Blossom had been only a phantom ship, the rivers a dream, a legend. It was all very pleasant and luxurious and strange, and Magnolia tried not to mind the clang of Clark Street by day and by night. The hideous cacophony of noise invaded their hotel apartment and filled its every corner. She wondered why the streetcar motormen jangled their warning bells so persistently. Did they do it as an antidote to relieve their own jangled nerves? "Papers! Morning papers! Crack, 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 crack!" The shooting gallery across the street, someone passing the bedroom door, walking heavily and clanking the metal disc of his room key, the sound of voices, laughter from the street, and the unceasing shuffle of footsteps on stone. Whee! Whoopa! Yay! Bro! A drunkard. She knew about that too, part of her recently acquired knowledge. Ravenel had told her about Big Steve Rowan, the 300-pound policeman, who, partly because of his goatee and mustache, and partly because of his expert manipulation of his official weapon, was called the Jack of Clubs. "You'll never see Big Steve arrest a drunk at night," Gay had explained to her, laughing. "No, sir, nor any other Clark Street cop, if he can help it. If they arrest a man, they have to appear against him the next morning at the 9 o'clock police court. That means getting up early. So if he's able to navigate at all, they pass him down the street from corner to corner until they get him headed west somewhere or north across the bridge. Great system." All this was amusing and colorful, perhaps, but scarcely conducive to tranquility and repose. Often Magnolia, lying awake by the side of the sleeping man or lying awake awaiting his late return, would close her stinging eyelids, the better to visualize and sense the deep velvet silence of the rivers of her girlhood. The black velvet nights, quiet, quiet, the lisping cluck-suck of the water against the hull. Clang! Morning papers! Crack! Yow! And then suddenly one day, "But Gay dear, how do you mean you haven't $100? It's for that bronze green velvet that you like so much, though I always think it makes me look sallow. You did urge me to get it. You did. No, dear. And now this is the third time they've sent the bill. So if you'll give me the money or write a check if you'd rather. I tell you I haven't got it, Nola. Oh, well, tomorrow will do. But please be sure tomorrow, because I can't be any surer tomorrow than I am today. I haven't got $100 in the world, and that's a fact. Even after he had finished explaining, she did not understand, could not believe it, continued to stare at him with those great, dark, startled eyes. Bad luck. At what? Faro? But Gay, thousands. Well, thousands don't last forever. Took a flyer. A flyer? Yes, a tip on the market. Market? The stock market. Stock? Oh, you wouldn't understand, but all of it, Gay. Well, some of it got lost at Faro. Where? Hankins. How much? What does it matter? It's gone. But Gay, how much at Faro? Oh, a few thousand. 5? Yes, 5. More than that? Well, nearer 10 probably. She noticed then that the Malacca cane was gone. She slipped her diamond ring off her finger, gave it to him. With the years, that became an automatic gesture. Thus, the change in their mode of living did not come about gradually. They were wafted with Cinderella-like celerity, from the coach and four to the kitchen ashes. They left the plush and ice water and fresh linen and rich food and luxurious service of the Sherman House for a grubby little family hotel that was really a sort of actor's boarding house on the north side, just across the Clark Street Bridge on Ontario Street. It was, Ravenal said, within convenient walking distance of places. What places? Magnolia asked, but she knew. A 10-minute saunter brought you to Gambler's Alley. In the next 15 years, there was never a morning when Gaylord Ravenel failed to prove this interesting geographical fact. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by FloraMetrick, Bonita Springs, Florida. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 14. The Ravenel reverses, if they were noticed at all, in Gambler's Alley, went politely unremarked. There was a curious and definite code of honor among the frequenters of Chicago's levee. You paid your gambling debts. You never revealed your own financial status by way of conversation. You talked little. You maintained a certain physical, sartorial, and social standard in the face of all reverses. There were, of course, always unmistakable signs to be read, even at the most passing glance. You drew your conclusions, made no comment. If you were seen to breakfast for days, a week, 2 weeks, at the cockeyed bakery, you were greeted by your confrère with the same suavity that would have been accorded you had you been standing treat at Billy Boyle's or the Palmer House. Your shoe might be cracked, but it must shine. Your linen might be frayed, but it must be clean. Your cheeks were perhaps a trifle hollow, but they must be shaven and smell pleasantly of bay rum. You might dine at Berkey's and Milan's, full meal 15 cents, with ravenous preliminary onslaughts upon the bread and butter and piccalilli. But you consumed delicately and fastidiously just so much and no more of the bountiful and rich repast spread out for your taking at Jeff Hankins or at Mike McDonald's. Though your suit was shabby, it must bear the mark of the tailor to the well-dressed sporting man, Billy McLean. If you were too impecunious for Hetty Chilson's, you disdained the window-tapping dives on Boiler Avenue and Lower Clark Street and State, the sinister and foul shanties of Big Maud and her ilk. You bathed, shaved, dressed, ate, smoked with the same exotic care when you were broke as when luck was running your way. Your cigar was a mild one, also part of the code, and this mild one usually a dead one as you played, and no one is too broke for one cigar a day. 12 o'clock, noon, found you awake. 12 o'clock, midnight, found you awake. Somewhere between those hours you slept the deep, sweet sleep of abstemious. You were, in short, a gambler and a gentleman. Thus, when the Ravenels moved, perforce, from the comfort of the Sherman to the threadbare shabbiness of the Ontario Street boarding house, there was nothing in Gaylord Ravenel's appearance to tell the tale. If his cronies knew of his financial straits, they said nothing. Magnolia had no women friends. During the year or more of their residence in Chicago, she had been richly content with Kim and Gay. The child had a prim and winning gravity that gave her a curiously grown-up air. "Do you know, Gay," Magnolia frequently said, "Kim sometimes makes me feel so gawky and foolish and young. When she looks at me after I've been amused about something, or am enthusiastic or excited, or, anyway, she looks at me out of those big eyes of hers, very solemn, and I feel, oh, Gay, you don't think she resembles, that is, do you think she's much like Mama?" "God forbid," ejaculated Ravenel piously. Kim had been Magnolia's delight during the late morning hours and the early afternoon. In company with the stolid nurse, they had fared forth in search of such amusement as the city provided for a child brought up amidst the unnatural surroundings of this one. The child had grown accustomed to seeing her nurse stand finger on lips, eyes commanding silence, before the closed door of her parents' room at 10 in the morning, at 11 even, and she got it into her baby head that this attitude then was the proper and normal one in which to approach the closed door of that hushed chamber. Late one morning, Magnolia, in nightgown and silken wrapper, had opened this door suddenly to find the child stationed there, silent, grave-eyed, admonitory, while in one corner against the door-case reposed the favorite doll of her collection, a lymphatic blonde whose eyes had met with some unfortunate interior mishap which gave them a dying calf look. This sprawling and inert lady was being shushed in a threatening and dramatic manner by the sternly maternal Kim. There was, at sight of this, that which brought the quick sting of tears to Magnolia's eyes. She gathered the child up in her arms, kissed her passionately, held her close, brought her to Ravenel as he lay yawning. "Gay, look at her. She was standing at the door, telling her doll not to make any noise. She's only a baby. We don't pay enough attention to her. Do you think I neglect her, standing there by the door? And it's nearly noon. Oh, Gay, we oughtn't be living here. We ought to be living in a house, a little house where it's quiet and peaceful and she can play." "Lovely," said Gay. "Thebes, for example. Now don't get dramatic, Nola, for God's sake. I thought we'd finished with that." With the change in their fortunes, the English nurse had vanished with the rest. She had gone, together with the hackneys, the high smart yellow cart, the violets, the green velvets, the box seat at the theater, the champagne. She or her counterpart never returned, but many of the lost luxuries did from time to time. There were better days to come, and worse. Their real fortune gone, there now was something almost humdrum and methodical about the regularity of their ups and downs. There rarely was an intermediate state. It was a feast or famine, always. They actually settled down to the life of a professional gambler and his family. Ravenel would have a run of luck at faro. Presto, rooms at the Palmer House, a box at the races, the theater, supper at Rector's. After the theater, hello, Gay. Evening, Mrs. Ravenel's. Somebody's looking mighty lovely tonight. A new sealskin sack, her diamond ring on her finger, 2 new suits of clothes for Ravenel, made by Billy McLean. A little dinner for Gay's friends at the Cardinal Bemis's famous place on Michigan Avenue. You couldn't fool the Cardinal. He would ask suavely, "What kind of a dinner, Mr. Ravenel?" If Gay replied, "Oh, a cocktail and a little red wine," Cardinal Bemis knew that luck was only so-so and that the dinner was to be good, but plainish. But if, in reply to the tactful question, Gay said magnificently, "A cocktail, Cardinal, claret, sauterne, champagne, and liqueurs," Bemis knew that Ravenel had had a real run of luck and prepared the canvasbacks boiled in champagne, or they were squabs or plover, with all sorts of delicacies, and the famous frozen watermelon that had been plugged, filled with champagne, put on ice for a day, and served in such chunks of scarlet fragrance as made the nectar and ambrosia of the gods seem poor, flavorless fare indeed. Magnolia, when luck was high, tried to put a little money by, as she had instinctively been prompted to do during those first months of their marriage, when they still were on the cotton blossom, but she rarely had money of her own. Gay, when he had ready cash, was generous, but not with the handing over of the actual coin itself. "Buy yourself some decent clothes, Nola, and the kid. Tell them to send me the bill. That thing you're wearing is terrible sight. It seems to me you haven't worn anything else for months," which was true enough. There was something fantastic about the magnificence with which he ignored the reason for her not having worn anything else for months. It had been certainly her one decent garment during the lean period just past, and she had cleaned and darned and refurbished to keep it so. Her experience in sewing during the old cotton blossom days stood her in good stead now. There were times when even the Ontario Street Hotel took on the aspect of unattainable luxury. That meant rock bottom. Then it was that the Ravenels took a room at $3 a week in a frowsy rooming house on Ohio or Indiana or Erie, the Bloomsbury of Chicago. There you saw unshaven men, their coat collars turned up in artless attempt to conceal the absence of linen, sallying forth, pail in hand, at 10 or 11 in the morning in search of the matutinal milk and rolls to accompany the coffee that was even now cooking over the gas jet. Morning was a musty jade on these streets, nothing fresh and dewy and sparkling about her. The ladies of the neighborhood lolled, huge, unwieldy, flaccid in wrappers. In the afternoon you saw them amazingly transformed into plump and pinkly powdered persons, snugly corseted, high-heeled, rustling in silk petticoats, giving out a heady scent. They were friendly, voluble ladies who beamed on the pale, slim Magnolia and said, "Won't you smile for me just a little bit, to the sedate and solemn-eyed Kim. Magnolia, too, boiled coffee and eggs over the gas jet in these lean times. Gravely, she counted out the 2 nickels that it would bring her and Kim home from Lincoln Park on the streetcar. Lincoln Park was an oasis, a life-giving breathing spot to the mother and child. They sallied forth in the afternoon, left the gas jet, the $3 room, the musty halls, the stout females behind them. There was the zoo, there was the lake, there was the grass. If the lake was their choice, it led inevitably to tales of the rivers. It was in this way that the background of her mother's life was first etched upon Kim's mind. The sight of the waters always filled Magnolia with nostalgia so acute as to amount to an actual physical pain. The childish treble would repeat the words as the 2 sat on a park bench facing the great blue sea that was Lake Michigan. "You remember that boat, don't you, Kim?" "Do I?" Kim's diction was curiously adult, due doubtless to the fact that she had known almost no children. "Of course you do, darling. Don't you remember the river and Grandma and Grandpa?" "Captain! Yes, I knew you remembered. And all the little darkies on the landing, and the band, and the steam organ. You used to put your hands over your ears and run and hide because it frightened you. And Joe and Queenie. Tell me about it." And Magnolia would assuage her own longing by telling and retelling the things she liked to remember. The stories, with the years, became a saga. Figures appeared, vanished, reappeared. The rivers wound through the hold. Ellie, Schultze, Julie, Steve, the man in the box with the gun, the old Creole belle, and Magnolia's first trip on the Mississippi. Mr. Pepper and the pilot house. All these became familiar and yet legendary figures and incidents to the child. They were her 3 Bears, her Bo Peep, her Red Riding Hood, her Cinderella. Magnolia must have painted these stories with the color of life itself, for the child never wearied of them. "Tell me the one about the time you were a little girl and Grandma locked you in the bedroom because she didn't want you to see the show and you climbed out of the window in your nightie." Kim Ravenel was probably the only white child north of the Mason-Dixon line who was sung to sleep to the tune of those plaintive, wistful Negro plantation songs which later were to come into such vogue as spirituals. They were the songs that Magnolia had learned from Black Joe and from Queenie, the erstwhile rulers of the Cotton Blossom Galley. "Swing low, sweet chariot," she sang. "Oh, wasn't that a wide river?" And, of course, all God's children got wings. Kim loved them. When she happened to be ill with some childhood ailment, they soothed her. Magnolia sang these songs always, as she had learned to sing them in unconscious imitation of the soft, husky Negro voice of her teacher. Through the years of Kim's early childhood, Magnolia's voice might have been heard thus wherever the shifting Ravenel fortunes had tossed the 3. Whether the red plush luxury of the Sherman house, the respectable dullness of the family hotel, or the sordid fustiness of the cheap rooming house. Once when they were living at the Sherman, Magnolia, seated in a rocking chair with Kim in her arms, had stopped suddenly in her song at a curious sound in the corridor. She had gone swiftly to the door, had opened it, and had been unable to stifle a little shriek of surprise and terror mingled. There stood a knot of black faces, teeth gleaming, eyes rolling, attracted by the song so rarely heard in the North. The Sherman House bellboys and waiters had eagerly gathered outside the closed door in what was, perhaps, as flattering and sincere a compliment as ever a singer received. Never did child know such ups and downs as did this daughter of the Chicago gambler and the showboat actress. She came to take quite for granted sudden and complete changes that would have disorganized anyone more conventionally bred. One week she'd find herself living in grubby quarters where the clammy, fetid ghost of cabbage lurked always in the hallways. The next would be a gay panorama of whisking waiters, new lace petticoats, drives along the lakefront, ice cream for dessert, front seats at the matinee. The theater bulked large in the life of the Ravenels. Magnolia loved it without being possessed of much discrimination with regard to it. Farce, comedy, melodrama, the whole gamut as outlined by Polonius, all held her interest, enthralled. Ravenel was much more critical than she. You saw him smoking in the lobby, bored, dégagé. It might be the opening of the rebuilt Lincoln Theater on Clark near Division with Gustav Frohman's company playing the charity ball. Oh, gay, isn't it exciting? I don't think much of it. Cheap-looking theater, too, isn't it? They might better have left it alone after it burned down. Kim's introduction to the Metropolitan Theater was when she was taken, a mere baby, to see the spectacle America at the Auditorium. Before she was 10, she had seen everyone from Julia Marlowe to Anna Held, from Bernhardt to Lillian Russell. Gravely she beheld the antics of the Rogers brothers, as gravely saw Claw and Erlanger's company in Foxy Quiller. It isn't that she doesn't see the joke, Magnolia confided to Ravenel almost worriedly. She actually doesn't seem to approve. Of course, I suppose I ought to be glad that she prefers the more serious things, but I wish she wouldn't seem quite so grown up at 10. By the time she's 20, she'll probably be spanking me and putting me to bed. Certainly Magnolia was young enough for 2. She was the sort of theater-goer who clutches the hand of her neighbor when stirred. When Ravenel was absent, Kim learned to sustain her mother at such emotional moments. The two frequently attended the theater together. Their precarious mode of living cut them off from sustained human friendships. But the theater was always there to stimulate them, to amuse them, to make them forget or remember. There were long afternoons to be filled, and many evenings as Ravenel became more and more deeply involved in the intricacies of Chicago's night world. There was, curiously enough, a pendulum-like regularity about his irregular life. His comings and goings could be depended on almost as though he were a clerk or a humdrum bookkeeper. Though his fortunes changed with bewildering rapidity, his habits remained the same. Indeed, he felt these changes much less than did Magnolia and Kim. No matter what their habitation, cheap rooming houses or expensive hotel, he left at about the same hour each morning, took the same leisurely course toward town, returned richer or poorer, but unruffled, well after midnight. On his off nights, he and Magnolia went to the theater. Curiously, they seemed always to have enough money for that. Usually they dwelt somewhere north, just on the other side of the Chicago River, at that time a foul-smelling and viscid stream with no drainage canal to deodorize it. Ravenel in lean times, emerging from his dingy hotel or rooming house on Ontario or Ohio, was as dapper, as suave, as elegant as that younger Ravenel had been who, leaning against the packing case on the wharf in New Orleans, had managed to triumph over the handicap of a cracked boot. He would stand a moment, much as he had stood that southern spring morning, coolly surveying the world about him. That his viewpoint was the dingy front stoop of a rundown Chicago rooming house, and his view the sordid street that held it, apparently disturbed his equanimity not at all. On rising, he had observed exactly the same niceties that would have been his had he enjoyed the services of a hotel valet. He bathed, shaved, dressed meticulously. Magnolia had learned early that the slatternly morning habits which he had taken for granted on the Cotton Blossom wives, Julie, Miss Means, Mrs. Soper, even the rather fastidious Ellie, would be found inexcusable in the wife of Ravenel. The sternly utilitarian undergarments of Parthi's choosing had soon enough been done away with, to be replaced with a froth of lace and tucks and embroidery and batiste. The laundering of these was a pretty problem when Pharaoh's frown decreed Ohio Street. Ravenel was spared these worrisome details. Once out of the dingy boarding house, he could take his day in his 2 hands and turn it over like a bright, fresh, minted coin. Each day was a new start. How could you know that you would not break the bank? It had been done on $1. Down the street, Ravenel would stroll past the ship chandlers and commissioned houses south of Ontario to the swinging bridge that spanned the slimy river. There he would slacken his already leisurely pace, or even pause a moment, perhaps, to glance at the steamers tied up at the dock. There was an occasional sailboat, a 3-masted schooner, the Finney. A grain boat was in from the north. Over to Clark and Lake, you could sniff in the air the pleasant scent of coffee. That was Reed and Murdoch's big warehouse, a little to the east. He sometimes went a block out of his way just to sniff this delicious odor. A glittering shoeshine at the Sherman House or the Tremont. "Good morning, George." "Morning, Mr. Ravenel." "Morning, Papa." "Sir?" No. His 50 cents budgeted did not include the dispensing of those extra pennies for the Times Herald, the Inter-Ocean, or the Tribune. They could be seen at McDonald's for nothing. A fine Chicago morning. The lake mist had lifted. There was one of the advantages of never rising early. Into the cockeyed bakery for breakfast. Tomorrow it would be boils. Surely his bad luck would break today. He felt it. Had felt it in the moment he opened his eyes. Terrapin and champagne tomorrow, Nola. Feel it in my bones. I woke up with my palms itching and passed a hunchback at Clark and Randolph last night. "Why don't you let me give you your coffee and toast here this morning, Gay dear? It'll only take a minute, and it's so much better than the coffee you get at the, downtown." Ravenel, after surveying his necktie critically in the mirror of the crazy little bureau, would shrug himself into his well-made coat. "You know I never eat in a room in which I have slept." Past the courthouse, corner of Washington reached, cut flowers in the glass case outside the basement's florist. A tapping on the glass with a coin, or a rapping on the pavement with his stick, if the Malacca stick was in evidence. "Hey, Joe!" Joe clattering up the wooden steps. "Here you are, sir, all ready for you. Just came in fresh." A white carnation. Ravenel would sniff the spicy bloom, snap the brittle stem, thrust it through the buttonhole of his lapel. A fine figure of a man from his boots to his hat, young, handsome, well-dressed, leisurely. Joe, the Greek florist, pocketed his quarter, would reflect gloomily on luck, his own and that of others. Ravenel might drop in a moment at Weeping Willow Mangler's, thence to Riley's pool hall near Madison for a look at the racing odds. But no matter how low his finances, he scorned the cheaper gambling rooms that catered to the clerks and the working men. There was a great difference between Jeff Hankins' place and that of his brother George. At George's place and others of his class, barkers stood outside. "Game upstairs, gentlemen, game upstairs. Come in and try your luck. 10 cents can make you a millionaire." At George Hankins, the faro checks actually were 10 cents. You saw their laboring men with their tin dinner pail, their boots lime-spattered, their garments reeking in cheap pipe tobacco. There, too, you found stud poker, roulette, hazard, percentage games. None of these for Ravenel. He played a gentleman's game, broke or flush. This game he found at Mike McDonald's, the store. Here he was at home. Here were excitement, luxury, companionship. Here he was Gaylord Ravenel. Fortune lurked just around the corner. At McDonald's, his credit was always good for enough to start the play. On the first floor was the saloon, with its rich walnut paneling, its great mirrors, its tables of teakwood and ivory inlay, its paintings of lolling ladies. Chicago saloons and gambling resorts vied with each other in rich and massive decoration. None of your soap-scrawled mirrors and fancy bottle structures for these. Prince Varnell's place had for years been famous for its magnificent built-in mantle of Mexican onyx, its great marble statue of the death of Cleopatra, its enormous Sèvres vases. The second floor was Ravenel's goal. He did not even glance at the whirling of the elaborately inlaid roulette wheels. He nodded to the dealers, and his greeting was deferentially returned. It was said that most of these men had come of fine old Southern families. They dressed the part, but MacDonald himself looked like a farmer. His black clothes, though well-made, never seemed to fit him. His black string tie never varied. Thin, short, gray-haired, Mike MacDonald, the boss of the gamblers, would have passed anywhere for a kindly rustic. "Playing today, Mr. Ravenel?" "Why, yes, I thought I'd play a while." "Anything we can do to make you comfortable?" "Well, yes." MacDonald would raise a benevolent, though authoritative hand. His finger would summon a menial. Dave, take care of Mr. Ravenal. Ravenal joined the others then, a gentleman gambler among gentlemen gamblers, a group smartly dressed like himself, well-groomed, quiet, almost elegant. Most of them wore jewelry, a diamond scarf pin, a diamond ring, sometimes even a diamond stud, though this was frowned on by players of Ravenel's class. A dead cigar in the mouth of each, little fine lines etched about their eyes. They addressed each other as, "Sir." "Thank you, sir." "Yours, I believe, sir." They were quiet. Yet there was an electric vibration in the air above and about the faro table. Only the dealer seemed remote, detached, unmoved. An hour passed, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Negro waiters in very white starched aprons moved deferentially from group to group. One would have said that no favoritism was being shown, but they knew the piker from the plunger, soft-voiced, coaxing. "Something to drink, sir? A little whiskey, sir? Cigar? Might you'd relish a little chicken white meat and a bottle of wine?" Ravenel would glance up abstractedly. "Time, is it?" "Pushing 6 o'clock, sir." Ravenel might interrupt the game to eat something, but this was not his rule. He ate usually after he had finished his play for the day. It was understood that he and others of his stamp were the guests of MacDonald or of Hankins. 25-cent cigars were to be had for the taking. Drinks of every description, hot food of the choicest sort and of almost any variety could be ordered and eaten as though this was one's own house and the servants of one's command. Hot soups and broths, steaks, chops, hot birds. You could eat this at a little white spread table alone or with your companions, or you could have it brought to you as you played. On long tables in the adjoining room were spread the cold viands, roast chickens, tongue, sausage, cheese, joints of roast beef, salad. Everything about the place gave to its inhabitants an illusion of plenty, of ease, of luxury. Soft red carpets, great prism-hung chandeliers, the clink of ice, the scent of sappy cigars and rich food, the soft slap-slap of the cards, the low voices of the dealers. It was all friendly, relaxed, soothing. Yet when the dealer opened the little drawer that was so cleverly concealed under his side of the table, the money drawer with its orderly stacks of yellowbacks and greenbacks and gold and silver, you saw, if your glance was quick and sharp enough, the gleam of still another metal, the glittering, sinister blue-gray of steel. 100 superstitions swayed their play. Luck was a creature to be wooed, flattered, coaxed, feared. No jungle voodoo worshipper ever lent himself to simpler or more childish practices and beliefs than did these hard-faced men. Sometimes Ravenel left the faro table penniless or even deeper in Mike MacDonald's debt. His face at such times was not more impassive than the bucolic's host's own. "Better luck next time, Mr. Ravenel." "She's due to return tomorrow, Mike. Watch out for me tomorrow. I'll probably clean you. And if not tomorrow, tomorrow. Luck must turn sooner or later." "There, 500, 1,000, 5,000. Did you hear about Ravenel?" "Yes, he had a wonderful run. It happened in an hour. He walked out with 10,000. More, some say." On these nights, Ravenel would stroll coolly home as on losing nights. Up Clark Street, the money in neat rolls in his pocket. There was almost no street robberies in those simpler Chicago days. If you were, like Ravenel, a well-dressed, sporting-looking man, strolling up Clark Street at midnight or thereabouts, you were likely to be stopped for the price of a meal. You gave it as a matter of course, unwrapping a bill, perhaps, from the roll you carried in your pocket. They might be living in modest comfort at the Revere House on Clark in Austin. They might be living in decent discomfort at the little theatrical boarding house on Ontario. They might be huddled in actual discomfort in the sordid room of the Ohio Street rooming house. But that as it may, Ravenel would take high-handed possession, but in a way so blithe, so gay, so charming, that no one could have withstood him, least of all his wife, who, though she knew him and understood him as well as anyone could understand this secretive and baffling nature, frequently despised him, often hated him, still was in love with him, and always would be. The child would be asleep in her corner, but Magnolia would be wide awake, reading or sewing or simply sitting there waiting. She never reproached him for the hours he kept. Though they quarreled frequently, it was never about this. Sometimes, as she sat there half dozing, her mind would go back to the rivers and gently float there. An hour or 2 hours would slip by. Now the curtain would be going down on the last act. Now the crowd, staying for the afterpiece and concert, would be moving down to occupy the seats nearer the stage. A song number by the ingenue, finishing with a clog or a soft shoe dance. The comic tramp, the character team in a patter act with a song. The afterpiece now, probably red-hot coffee or some similar standby. Now the crowd was leaving. The band struck up its last number. Up the riverbank scrambled the last straggler. You never threw me my line at all. There I was like a stuck pig. Well, how did I know you were going to leave out that business with the door? Why didn't you tell me? Say, Ed, will you go over my song with me a minute? You know, that place where it goes tum-ty-tum-ty tum-tum-tum, and then I vamp. It's kind of went sour tonight, seemed to me. A bit of supper, coffee cooked over a spirit lamp, lumps of yellow cheese, a bite of ham, relaxation after strain, a daubing with cold cream, a sloshing of water. Quieter, more quiet, quiet, darkness, security. No sound but that of the river flowing by. Sometimes if she dozed, she was wakened by the familiar hoot of a steamer whistle, some big lake boat perhaps, bound for Michigan or Minnesota, or a river barge or tug on the Chicago River nearby. She would start up, bewildered, scarcely knowing whether she had heard the horse blast or whether it was only, after all, part of her dream about the river and the cotton blossom. Ravenel coming swiftly up the stairs, Ravenel's quick, light tread in the hall. Come on, Nola, we're leaving this rat's nest. Gay, dear, not now. You don't mean tonight. Now, it'll only take a minute. I'll wake up this slavey. She'll help. No, I'd rather do it myself. Oh, Gay, Kim's asleep. Can't we wait until morning? But somehow the fantastic procedure appealed tremendously to her love of the unexpected. Packing up and moving on. The irresponsible gaiety of it all. The gas turned high. Out tumbled the contents of bureau drawers and boxes and trunks. Finery saved from just such another lucky day. Froth and foam of lace and silk strewn incongruously about this murky little chamber, with its frayed carpet and stained walls and crazy chairs. They spoke in half whispers, so as not to wake the child. They were themselves like two children, eager, excited, laughing. Where are we going, Gay? Sherman. Or how would you like to try the auditorium for a change? Rooms looking out over the lake. Gay! Her hands clasped as she knelt in front of a trunk. Next week we'll run down to West Baden. Do us good. During the day we can walk and drive or ride. You ought to learn to ride, Nola. In the evening we can take a whirl at Sam Maddox's layout. Oh, don't play there. Not much, I mean. Let's try to keep what we have for a little while. After all, we may as well give Sam a chance to pay our expenses. Remember the last time we were down, I won 1,000 at roulette alone, and roulette isn't my game. He awoke the landlady and paid his bill in the middle of the night. She did not resent being thus disturbed. Women rarely resented Gaylord Ravenel's lack of consideration. They were off in a hack fetched by Ravenel from the nearby cab stand. It was no novelty for Kim to fall asleep in the dingy discomfort of a North Side rooming house and to wake up amidst the bright luxuriousness of a hotel suite, without ever having been conscious of the events which had wrought this change. Instead of milk out of the bottle and an egg cooked over the gas jet, there was a shining breakfast tray bearing mysteriously round domed dishes whose covers you whipped off to disclose what not of savory delights. Crisp curls of bacon, parsley-decked eggs baked in actual bubbling in a brown crockery container, hot golden buttered toast, and her mother calling gaily from the next room, "Drink your milk with your breakfast, Kim, darling. Don't gulp it all down in one swallow at the end." It was easy enough for Kim to believe in those fairy tales that had to do with kindly sprites who worked miracles overnight. A whole staff of such good creatures seemed pretty regularly occupied with the Ravenel affairs. Once a month there came a letter from Mrs. Hawks, no more and no less. That indomitable woman was making a great success of her business. Her letters bristled with complaint, but between the lines Magnolia could read satisfaction and even a certain grim happiness. She was boss of her world, such as it was. Her word was final. The modern businesswoman had not yet begun her almost universal battle against the male in his own field. She was considered unique. Tales of her prowess became river lore. Parthy Ann Hawks, owner and manager of the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theater, strong, erect, massive, her eyebrows black above her keen, cold eyes, her abundant hair scarcely touched with gray, was now a well-known and important figure on the rivers. She ran her boat like a pirate captain. He who displeased her walked the plank. It was said that the more religious rivermen who hailed from the Louisiana parishes always crossed themselves fearfully at her approach and considered a meeting with the cotton blossom a bad omen. The towering black-garbed form standing like a ship's figurehead, grim and portentous, as the boat swept downstream, had been known to give a really devout Catholic captain a severe and instantaneous case of chills and fever. Her letters to Magnolia were characteristic. "Well, Maggie, I hope you and the child are in good health. Often and often I think land knows what kind of bringing up she is getting with the life you are leading. I can imagine. Well, you made your own bed and now you can lie in it. I have no doubt that he has run through every penny of your money that your poor father worked so hard to get, as I predicted he would. I suppose you heard all about the French's new sensation. French has the worst luck, it does seem. She sank 6 weeks ago at Medley's just above New Madrid. The fault of the pilot it was. Carelessness, if ever I heard it. He got caught in the downdraft of a gravel bar and snagged her, they say. I think of your poor pa and how he met his end. It took 2 weeks to raise her, though she was only in 6 feet of water. On top of that, his other boat, the Goldenrod, you remember, went down about 4 weeks ago in the Illinois near Hardin. A total loss. Did you ever hear of such luck? Business is pretty good. I can't complain. But I have to be right on hand every minute or they would steal me blind, and that's the truth. I have got a new heavy. No great shakes as an actor, but handy enough and pretty good black face in the concert, and they seem to like him. We had a pretty rough audience all through the coal country, but whenever it looked like a fighting started, I'd come out in front and stand there a minute and say if anybody started anything, I would have the boat run out to the middle of the river and sink her. That I'd never had a fight on my boat and wasn't going to begin any such low-life shenanigans now. Magnolia got a swift mental picture of this menacing black-garbed figure standing before the gay, crude curtain, the footlights throwing grim shadows on her stern face. That implacable woman was capable of cowering even a tough coal belt audience bent on a fight. Crops are pretty good, so business is according. I put up grape jelly last week. A terrible job, but I can't abide this store stuff made of gelatin or some, and no real grapes in it at all. Well, I suppose you're too stylish for the cotton blossom by now, and Kim never hears of it. I got the picture you sent. I think she kind of looks peaked. Up all hours of the night, I suppose, and no proper food. What kind of an education is she getting? You wrote about how you were going to send her to a convent school. I never heard of such a thing. Well, I will close, as goodness knows I have enough to do besides writing letters where they are probably not wanted. Still, I like to know how you and the child are doing and all. Your mother, Parthenia Ann Hawks. These epistles always filled Magnolia with an emotion that was a poisonous mixture of rage and tenderness and nostalgia. She knew that her mother, in her harsh way, loved her grandchild, often longed to see them both. Parthy's perverse and inhibited nature would not permit her to confess this. She would help them with money, Magnolia knew, if they needed help. But first she must know the grisly satisfaction of having them say so. This Magnolia would not do, though there were many times when her need was great. There was Kim, no longer a baby. This feverish and irregular life could not go on for her. Magnolia's letters to her mother, especially in lean times, were triumphs of lying pride. Sentimental Tommy's mother, writing boastfully home about her black silks and her gold chains, was never more stiff-necked than she. Gay is more than good to me. I have only to wish for a thing. Everyone says Kim is unusually tall and bright for her age. He speaks of a trip to Europe next year, new fur coat, never an unkind word, very happy. Still, if Magnolia was clever at reading between the lines of her mother's bald letters, so too was Parthenia at hers. In fact, Parthy took many a random shot that struck home, as when once she wrote tartly, "Fur coat one day and none the next, I'll be bound." End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Yoganandh. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 15. The problem of Kim's education, of Kim's future, was more and more insistently borne upon her. She wanted money of her own with which to provide security for the child. Ravenal's improvident method was that of Paddy and the leaky roof. When luck was high and he was showering her and Kim with luxuries, he would say, "But good God, haven't you got everything you want? There's no satisfying you any more, Nola." When he had nothing, he would throw out his hands, palms upward, in a gesture of despair. "I haven't got it, I tell you. I give you everything I can think of when I'm flush. And now, when I'm broke, you nag me." "But Kay, that's just it. Everything one day and nothing the next. Couldn't we live like other people in between? Enough and none of this horrible worrying about tomorrow. I can't bear it." "You should have married a plumber." She found herself casting about in her mind for ways in which she could earn money of her own. She took stock of her talents, a slim array. There was her experience on the showboat stage. She could play the piano a little. She could strum the banjo, relic of Joe's and Queenie's days, in the old cotton blossom, low-rafted kitchen. She had an untrained, true, and rather moving voice of mediocre quality. Timidly, with a little nervous spot of dread showing in either cheek, she broached this to Ravenal one fine afternoon when they were driving out to the Sunnyside Hotel for dinner. Gaylord had had a run of luck the week before. Two sleek, handsome chestnuts seemed barely to flick the road with their hoofs as they flew along. The smart high cart glittered with yellow varnish. None of your cheap livery rigs for Ravenal. Magnolia was exhilarated, happy. Above all else, she loved to drive into the country or the suburbs behind a swift pair of horses. Ravenal was charming, pleased with himself, with his handsome, well-dressed young wife, with the cart, the horses, the weather, the prospect of one of old man Dowling's excellent dinners. They sped through Lincoln Park. Their destination was a 2 hours drive north outside the city limits, a favorite rendezvous for Chicago's sporting world. At Dowling's, one had supper at $1 a head, and such a supper. The beefsteak could be cut with a fork. Old man Dowling bred his own fine fat cattle. Old lady Dowling raised the plump broilers that followed the beefsteak. There was green corn grown in Dowling's garden, fresh plucked tomatoes, young onions. There was homemade ice cream. There was a huge chocolate cake, each slice a gigantic edifice, alternating layers of black and white. "Can't I drive a while, Gay dear?" "They are pretty frisky. You better wait till we get out a ways where there aren't so many rigs." The fine, cool, late summer day had brought out all manner of vehicles. By that time, the nags will have some of the skittishness worked out of them too. "But I like to have them when they are skittish. Papa always used to let me take them." "Yes. Well, these aren't canal boat mules, you know. Why can't you be content just to sit back and enjoy the drive? You're getting to be like one of those bloomer girls they joke about. You'll be wanting to wear the family pants next." "I am enjoying it. Only don't be like your mother, Nola." She lapsed into silence. During one of their many sojourns at the Ontario State Hotel, she had struck up a passing acquaintance with a large, over-friendly blonde actress with green gold hair and the tightest of black bodices stretched over an imposing shelf of bosom. This one had surveyed the Ravenal menage with a shrewd and kindly, though slightly bleary eye, and had given Magnolia some sound advice. "Why not you go out more, dearie?" she had asked one evening when she herself was arrayed for festivity in such a bewilderment of flounces, bugles, jets, plumes, bracelets, and chains as to give the effect of a lighted Christmas tree in the narrow, dim hallway. She had encountered Magnolia in the corridor, and Nola had written the woman's gusty greeting with a shy and faintly wistful smile. "Out more evenings. Young thing like you. I notice you're home with the little girl most of the time. I guess you think that run is about all I do." Magnolia resented this somewhat, but she reflected instantly this was a friendly and well-meaning creature. She reminded her faintly of Ellie somehow. Ellie as she might be now, perhaps blousy, overblown, middle-aged. "Oh, I go out a great deal," she said politely. "Husband home?" demanded the woman bluntly. She was engaged in the apparently hopeless task of pulling a black kid glove over a massive arm. Magnolia's fine eyebrows came up in a look of hauteur that she unconsciously had borrowed from Ravenal. "Mr. Ravenal is out," and started on toward her room. The woman caught her hand. "Now, don't be huffy, dear. I'm an older woman than you, and I've seen a good deal. You stay home with the kid and your husband goes out, and will he like you any better for it? Nit. Now leave me tell you, when he asks you to go somewhere with him, you go, want to or not, because if you don't, there's those that will, and pretty soon he'll quit asking you." She had waddled stiffly down the hallway, then in her absurdly high-heeled slippers, leaving a miasma of perfume in the passage. Magnolia had been furious, then amused, then thoughtful, then grateful. In the last few years she had met or seen the wives of professional gamblers. It was strange. They were all quiet, rather sad-faced women, home-loving, and usually accompanied by a well-dressed and serious child. Much like herself and Kim, she thought. Sometimes she met them in Ohio Street. She thought she could recognize the wife of a gambler by the look in her face. Frequently she saw them coming hurriedly out of one of the many pawn shops on North Clark near the river. The windows of these shops fascinated her. They held often such intimate, revealing, and mutely appealing things: a doll, a wedding ring, a cornet, a meerschaum pipe, a Masonic emblem, a Bible, a piece of lace, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. She thought of these things now as she sat so straight and smartly dressed beside Ravenal in the high yellow cart. She stole a glance at him. The color was high in his cheeks. His box-cut covered coat with the big pearl buttons was a dashingly becoming garment. In the buttonhole bloomed a great pom-pom of chrysanthemum. He looked very handsome. Magnolia's head came up spiritedly. "I don't want to wear the pants, but I would like to have some say-so about things. There's Kim. She isn't getting the right kind of schooling. Half the time she goes to private schools, and half the time to public, and half the time to no school at all. Oh, well, I know there aren't three halves, but anyway, and it isn't fair. It's because half the time we have got money, and half the time we haven't any. Oh God, here we are, driving off for pleasure. But Gay dear, you've got to think of those things. And so I wondered, Gay, I'd like to earn some money of my own." Ravenal cut the chestnuts sharply with his whip. "Pooh," thought Magnolia, "he can't scare me that way. How like a man, to take it out on the horses just because he's angry." She slipped her hand through his arm. Don't jerk my arm like that. You'll have them running away in a minute." "I should think they would after the way you slashed them. Sometimes I think you don't care about horses as horses any more than you do about—" She stopped aghast. She had almost said, "than you do about me as a wife." A long breath. Then, "Gay darling, I'd like to go back on the stage. I'd like to act again. Here, I mean in Chicago." She was braced for a storm and could have weathered it, but his shouts of laughter startled and bewildered her and the sensitive chestnuts as well. At this final affront they bolted, and for the next 15 minutes Magnolia clutched the little iron rod at the end of the seat with one hand and clung to her hat with the other as the outraged horses stretched their length down the rutty country road, eyes flaming, nostrils distended, hoofs clattering, the light high cart rocking and leaping behind them. Ravenal's slender weight was braced against the footboard. The veins in his wrist shone blue against dead white. With a tearing sound, his right sleeve ripped from his coat. Little beads of moisture stood out about his mouth and chin. Magnolia, white-lipped, tense, and terribly frightened, magnificently uttered no sound. If she had been one of your screamers, there probably would have been a sad end. Slowly, gradually, the chestnut slowed a trifle, slackened, resumed a normal pace, stood panting as Ravenal drew up at the side of the road. They actually essayed to nibble innocently at some sprigs of grass growing by the roadside, while Ravenal wiped his face and neck and hands slowly with his fine perfumed linen handkerchief. He took off his black derby hat and mopped his forehead and the headband of his hat's splendid white satin lining. He fell to swearing softly, this being the form in which the male, relieved after fright, tries to deny that he has been frightened. He turned to look at her, his eyes narrow. She turned to look at him, her great eyes wide. She leaned toward him a little, her hand over her heart. And then suddenly they both began to laugh, so that the chestnuts pricked up their ears again and Ravenal grabbed the reins. They laughed because they were young and had been terribly frightened and were now a little hysterical following the strain, and because they loved each other, so that their fear of injury and possible death had been for each a double horror. "That's what happens when you talk about going on the stage," said Ravenal. "Even the horses run at the thought. I hope this will be a lesson to you." He gathered up the reins. "A person would think I had never been an actress and knew nothing of the stage." "You don't think that Catch as Catch Can performance was acting, do you? Or that Hole in the Wall a stage? Or that Old Tub a theatre? Are those plays? Good God, do you remember? So, if he loves you, go with him. If he ain't good to you—" "But I do," cried Magnolia. "I do think so. I loved it. Everybody in the company was acting because they liked it. They'd rather do it than anything in the world. Maybe we weren't very good, but the audiences thought we were, and they cried in the places where they were supposed to cry, and laughed when they should have laughed, and believed it all, and were happy. And if that isn't the theatre, then what is? Chicago isn't a river dump, and Chicago audiences aren't rubes. You've seen Moses Khan Mansfield, and Bernhardt, and Jefferson, and Ada Rehan since then. Surely you know the difference." "That's the funny part of it. I don't much. Oh, I don't mean they haven't got genius. And they have been beautifully directed, and the scenery and costumes and all. But I don't know. They do exactly the same things. Do them better, but the same things that Schultz told us to do, and the audiences laugh at the same things and cry at the same things. And they go trooping around the country on land instead of water, but trooping just the same. They play heroes and heroines in plays all about love and adventure. And the audiences go out blinking with the same kind of look on their faces that the Rivertown audiences used to have, as though somebody had just waked them up. Don't be silly, darling. Ah, here we are." And here they were. They had arrived in ample time, so that Magnolia chatted shyly and Ravenal chatted charmingly with Pa and Ma Dowling, and Magnolia was reminded of Thebes as she examined the shells and paper roses and china figurines in the parlor. The dinner was excellent, abundant, appetizing. Scarcely were they seated at the long table near the window when there was heard a great fanfare and hullabaloo outside. Up the winding driveway swept a tally-ho, and out of it spilled a party of Chicago bloods, in fawn-covered coats and derby hats and ascot ties and shiny pointed shoes, and they gallantly assisted the very fashionable ladies who descended the perilous steps with much shrill squealing and shrieking, and maidenly clutching at skirts, which clutchings failed satisfactorily of their purpose. Some of the young men carried banjos and mandolins. The 4 horses jangled their metal-trimmed harness and curveted magnificently. Up the steps swarmed the gay young men and shrill young women. On closer sight, Magnolia noticed that some of these were not, after all, so young. "Good God!" Ravenal had exclaimed, and had frowned portentously. "Do you know them, Gay? It's Bliss Chapin's gang. He's giving a party. He's going to be married day after tomorrow. They are making a night of it." "Really? How lovely. Which one is the girl he's going to marry? Point her out." And for the second time Ravenal said, "Don't be silly, darling." They entered the big dining room on a wave of sound and color. They swarmed the table. They snatched up bits of bread and pickles and celery and munched them before they were seated. They caught sight of Ravenal. "Gay." "Well, I'm damned. Gay, you old foxy quiller. So that's why you wouldn't come out. Hey, Blanche? Look, here's Gay, the bad boy. Look who is here." "I thought you were going out to Cramp's place," Gay said sullenly in a low voice to one of the men. He chose the wrong confidant, the gentleman being neither reticent nor ebriate. He raised his voice to a shout. "That's a good one. Listen, Foxy Gay thought we were going out to Cramp's place, so what does he do? He brings his lady here. Hey, Blanche, do you hear that? Now you know why he couldn't come." He bent upon Magnolia a look of melting admiration. "And can you blame him?" "Altogether, no." "You go to hell," said the lady named Blanche from the far end of the table, though without anger, or rather in the manner of one who is ready with a choice bit of repartee. Indeed, it must have been so considered, for at its utterance Mr. Bliss Chapin's prenuptial group uttered shouts of approbation. "Shut up, you jackass," said Ravenal, then sotto voce, and oh ho below the Tisa. Little Gay is afraid he'll get in trouble with his lady friend. Gay's lady friend now disproved for all time her gentleman friend's recent accusation that she knew nothing about the art of acting. She raised her head and gazed upon the roistering crew about the long table. Her face was very white, her dark eyes were enormous. She was smiling. "Won't you introduce me to your friends, Gay?" she said in a clear and lovely voice. "Don't be a fool," whispered Ravenal at her side. The host, Bliss Chapin, stood up rather red-faced and fumbling with his napkin. He was not sober, but his manner was formal, deferential even. "Mrs. Ravenal, I charmed. I remember seeing you. Someone pointed you out in a box at the. He gave it up and decided to run the two words together. "Theatre. Chapin's my name. Bliss Chapin. Call me Bliss. Everybody calls me Bliss." He decided to do the honors. He indicated each guest with a graceful, though vague wave of the hand. "Stantine, Fifi, Gertie, Violet, Blanche, Mignon. Lovely girls. Lovely. But we'll let that pass. Georgie Skiff, Tom Haggerty, Billy Little Billy we call him. Pretty cute, huh? Know what I mean? Dave Lansing, Jerry Darling. That's his actual name. Can you imagine what the girls can do with name like that? Boys and girls, this is Mrs. Gaylord Ravenal, wife of the well-known Pharaoh expert. And a lucky dog he is too. No offense, I hope. Just my rough way. I'm going to be married tomorrow. Anything goes this evening." Prolonged applause and shouting. The twanging of mandolins and banjos. "Speech," shouted the man who had first called attention to Magnolia. "Speech by Mrs. Ravenal." They took it up shrilly, hoarsely, the Fifis, the Violets, the Billies, the Gerties, the Jerrys. Speech, speech. Ravenal got to his feet. "You've got to go," he began. "Sorry." "Sit down. Throw him out, Foxy Gay. Shut up, Gay." Ravenal turned to Magnolia. "We'll have to get out of this," he said. He put a hand on her arm. His hand was trembling. She turned her head slowly and looked up at him, her eyes blank, the smile still on her face. "Oh no," she said, and shook her head. "Oh no. I like it here, Gay dear." "Speech!" yelled the Tantines, the Mignons, the Daves, beating on their plates with their spoons. Magnolia brought one hand up to her throat in a little involuntary gesture that betokened breathlessness. There was nothing else to indicate how her heart was hammering. I can't make a speech," she began in a lovely voice. "Speech, speech." She looked at Ravenal. She felt a little sorry for him. "But I'll sing you a song if you lend me a banjo, someone." She took the first of a half-dozen instruments thrust toward her. "Magnolia, do sit down, Gay dear, and stop fidgeting about so. It's all right. I'm glad to entertain your friends." She still wore the little set smile. "I'm going to sing a song I learned from the Negroes when I was a little girl and lived on a showboat on the Mississippi River." She bent her head above the banjo and began to thumb it softly. Then she threw her head back slightly. One foot tapped emphasis on the music's cadence. Her lids came down over her eyes, closed down over them. She swayed a little gently. It was an unconscious imitation of old Joe's attitude. "It's called Deep River. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a song the niggers used to." She began to sing softly. "Deep River." When she had finished, there was polite applause. "I think it's real sweet," announced the one they called Violet, and began to snivel unbecomingly. Mr. Tom Haggerty now voiced the puzzlement which had been clouding his normal cheerful countenance. "You called it a coon song, and maybe it is. I don't dispute you, mind, but I never heard any song like that called a coon song, and I heard a good many coon songs in a day. I won them presents back and a hot time, and Mr. Johnson turned me loose." "Sing another," they said, still more politely. "Maybe something not quite so sad. You will have us thinking we are at a prayer meeting next. First thing you know, Violet here will start repentance." So she sang "All God's Children Got Wings." They wagged their heads and tapped their foot to that. "I got a wings, you got a wings, all of God's children got a wings." When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my wings. I'm going to fly all over God's heaven. Well, that they all agreed was better. That was more like it. The red-faced cut-up rose on imaginary wings to show how he, too, was going to fly all over God's heaven. The forthright Blanche refused to be drawn into the polite acclaim. If you ask me, she announced moodily, I think they are rotten. I like something a little more lively myself, said the girl called Fifi. Do you know what? Marry that girl. I heard May Irvin sing it. She was grand. No, said Magnolia. That's the only kind of song I know, really. She stood up. I think we must be going now. She looked across the table, her great dark eyes fixed on the red-faced bridegroom. I hope you will be very happy. A toast to Ravenals, to Gaylord Ravenal and Mrs. Ravenal. She acknowledged that too charmingly. Ravenal bowed stiffly and glowered, and for the second time that day wiped his forehead and chin and wrist with his fine linen handkerchief. The chestnuts were brought round. Bliss Chapin's crew crowded out to the veranda of the dining room. Magnolia stepped lightly up to the seat beside Ravenal in the high dog cart. It was dusk. A sudden sharpness had come into the evening air as always, toward the autumn in the Lake Michigan region. Magnolia shivered a little and drew about her the little absurd flounced shoulder cape so recently purchased. The crowd on the veranda had caught the last tune and were strumming it now on their banjos and mandolins. The kindly light behind them threw their foolish faces into shadow. You heard their voices, plaintive, even sweet. The raucous note fled for the moment. Fifi's voice and Jerry's, Gertie's voice and little Billy's. I got wings, you got wings, all God's children got wings. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my wings, I'm going to fly. Magnolia turned to wave to them as the chestnuts made the final curve in the driveway and stretched eagerly toward home. Silence between the two for a long half-hour. Then Ravenal, almost humbly, Well, I suppose I am in for it, Nola. Shoot. But she had been thinking, I must take things in hand now. I've been like a foolish young girl when I'm really quite an old married woman. I suppose being bossed by Mama so much did that. I must take Kim in hand now. What a fool I've been. Don't be silly, darling. He was right. I've been... Aloud she said, only half consciously, that he had spoken. What did you say? You know very well what I said. I suppose I'm in for one of your mother's curtain lectures. Go on. Shoot and get it over. Don't be silly, darling, said Magnolia a trifle maliciously. What a lovely starlight night it is. She laughed a little. Do you know, those doe-faced Fifis and Tantines and Mignons were just like the Ohio and Illinois farm girls dressed up. The ignorant girls we used to come to see the show. I'll bet when they were on the farm, barefooted, poor things, they were Annie and Jenny and Tilly and Emma right enough. The end of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by FloraMetrick, Bonita Springs, Florida. Showboat by Edna Ferber, Chapter 16. And this, said Sister Cecilia, is the chapel. She took still another key from the great bunch on her keychain and unlocked the big, gloomy double doors. It was incredible that doors and floors and wainscoting so shiny with varnish could still diffuse such an atmosphere of gloom. She entered ahead of them with the air of a cicerone. It seemed to Magnolia that the corridors were tunnels of murk. It was like a prison. Magnolia took advantage of this moment to draw closer still to Kim. She whispered hurriedly in her ear, Kim, darling, you don't need to stay. If you don't like it, we'll slip away, and you needn't come back. It's so gloomy. But I do like it, said Kim in her clear, decisive voice. It's so shiny and clean and quiet. In spite of her lovely Ravenal features, which still retained something of their infantile curves, she looked at that moment startlingly like her grandmother, Parthenia Ann Hawks. They followed Sister Cecilia into the chapel. Magnolia shivered a little. In giving Kim a convent education, it was not in Magnolia's mind to prepare her for those Sunday theatrical page interviews beginning, I was brought up by the dear sisters of the convent. For that matter, the theater, as having any part in Kim's future, never once entered Magnolia's mind. Why this should have been true, it is difficult to say, considering the child's background, together with the fact that she was seeing Camille and Ben-Hur and the Rogers brothers in Central Park at an age when other little girls were barely permitted to go to cocoa parties in white muslin and blue sashes where they might, if they were lucky, see the funny man take the rabbit out of the hat. The non-sectarian girls' school of good standing looked askance at would-be entrants whose parentage was as socially questionable, not to say bizarre, as that represented by Ravenal, Mère and Père. The daughter of a professional gambler and an ex-showboat actress would have received short shrift at the hands of the headmistress of Miss Digman's School for Girls at something or other on the Hudson. The convent school then opened its gloomy portals to as motley a collection of jeunes filles as could be imagined under one roof. In the prim, dim corridors and cubicles of St. Agatha's on Wabash Avenue South, you might see a score of girlish pupils who, in spite of the demure face, the sleek braids, the severe uniform, the modest manner, the prune and prism expression, still resembled in a startling degree this or that vivacious lady whose name was associated with the notorious Everleigh Club, or with the music halls and museums thriving along Clark Street or Madison or Dearborn. Visiting day at St. Agatha's saw an impressive line of smart broughams outside the great solemn brick building, and the ladies who emerged therefrom, while invariably dressed in garments of somber color and restrained cut, still produced the effect of being attired in what is known as fast black. They gave forth a heady, musky scent, and the mold of their features, even when transformed by the expression that crept over them as they gazed upon those girlish faces so markedly resembling their own, had a look as though the potter had used a heavy thumb. The convent had been Magnolia's idea. Ravenel had laughed when she broached the subject to him. "She'll be well fed and housed and generally cared for there," he agreed, "and she'll learn French and embroidery and deportment and maybe some arithmetic, if she's lucky. But every shady lady on Clark Street sends her daughter there. She's got to go somewhere, Gay. This pillar-to-post life we're leading is terrible for a child." "What about your own life when you were a child? I suppose you led a prissy existence?" "It was routine compared to Kim's. When I went to bed in my little room on the Cotton Blossom, I at least woke up in it the next morning. Kim goes to sleep on North Clark and wakes up on Michigan Avenue. She never sees a child her own age. She knows more bellboys and chambermaids and waiters than a traveling man. She thinks a dollar bill is something to buy candy with, and that when a stocking has a hole in it, you throw it away. She can't do the simplest problem in arithmetic. And yesterday I found her leaning over the second-floor rotunda rail, spitting on the heads of people in the—" "Did she hit anybody?" "It isn't funny, Gay." "It is too. I've always wanted to do it." "Well, so have I. But anyway, it won't be funny 5 years from now." St. Agatha's occupied half of one of Chicago's huge square blocks. Its great flight of front steps was flush with the street, but at the back was a garden discreetly protected by a thick brick wall fully 10 feet high and belligerently spiked. St. Agatha herself and a whole host of attendant cherubim looked critically down upon Magnolia and Kim as they ascended the long, broad flight of steps that led to the elaborately and lumpily carved front door. Of the two, Magnolia was the more terrified. The windows glittered so sharply. The stairs were so clean. The bell, as they rang it, seemed to echo so hollowly through endless unseen halls and halls and halls. The hand that opened the door had been preceded by no sound of human footsteps. The door had loomed before them, seemingly as immovable as the building itself. There was the effect of black magic in its sudden and noiseless opening. The great entrance hall waited still and dim. The black-robed figure before them was vaguely surmounted by a round white face that had the look of being no face at all, but a flat circular surface on which features had been clumsily daubed. "I came to see about placing my little girl in school." The flat surface broke up surprisingly into a smile. She was no longer mysterious and somber figure, but a middle-aged person, kindly, but not especially bright. This way led to a small and shiny office, presided over by another flat, circular surface. This, in turn, gave way to a large and almost startlingly sunny room, one flight up, where sat at a desk a black-robed figure different from the rest. A large pink face, penetratingly shrewd blue eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles, a voice that was deep without resonance, a woman with the look of the ruler, Parthy, practically, in the garb of a mother superior. "Oh, my goodness," thought Magnolia in a panic. She held Kim's cool little hand tight in her own agitated fingers. Of the two, she was incalculably the younger. The classrooms, the sewing room, sister this, sister that, the garden, little hard benches, prim gravel paths, holy figures in stone brooding down upon the well-kept flower beds, saints and angels and apostles. When all those glittering windows were dark, and the black-robed figures within lay in slumber, their hands surely crossed on their barren breasts, and the flat circular surfaces reposed exactly in the center of the hard pillows, and the moonlight flooded this cloistered garden spot with the same wanton witchery that enveloped a Sicilian bower. Did these pious stone images turn suddenly into fauns and nymphs and dryads? Magnolia wondered, wickedly. Aloud, I see. Oh, the refectory, I see. Prayers, 7 o'clock. Dark blue dresses, every Thursday from 2 to 5. And sewing and music and painting as well. And this was the chapel, I see. And this was her bedroom, to be shared with another pupil. But she has always had her own. It is a rule, I see. I'll let you know. It's Kim. I know it is. But that's her name, really. She was born in Kentucky and Illinois and Missouri. That is, yes, it does sound. No, I don't think she'll like to have you call her anything else. She's so used to it. I'd like you to know, may I? I'd like to talk it over with her to see if she thinks she'd be happy. In the garden, in various classrooms, in the corridors, and on the stairs, they had encountered girls from 10 to 16, or even 18 years of age, and they were all dressed exactly alike, and they had all flashed a quick, grim look at the visitors from beneath demure lids. Magnolia had sensed a curious undercurrent of plot, of mischief. Hidden, secret thoughts scurried up the bare, varnished walls, lurked grinning in the stairway niches. They were back in the big sunny second-floor room after their tour of inspection. The pink-faced Parthy person was regarding them with level brows. Magnolia was clinging more tightly than ever to Kim's hand. It was as though the child were supporting her, not she the child. "But I know now whether I like it or not," Kim had spoken up astonishingly. "I like it." Magnolia was horrified to find that she had almost cried. "Oh, no, Kim," aloud. She said instead, "Are you sure, darling? You needn't stay unless you want to. Mother just brought you to see if you might like it." "I do," repeated Kim patiently, as one speaks to an irritating child. Magnolia was conscious of a sinking sense of disappointment. She had hoped, perversely enough, that Kim would stamp her feet, throw herself screaming on the floor, and demand to be carried out of the bare, clean, orderly place back to the delightful welter of Clark Street. She could not overcome the feeling that in thus bestowing upon Kim a ladylike education and background, she was depriving her of something rich and precious and colorful. She thought of her own childhood. She shut her eyes so as to see more clearly the pictures passing in her mind. Deep rivers, wide rivers, willows by the water's edge trailing gray-green, dogwood in fairy bloom, darkies on the landing, plickety-plunk, plunk, plunk, plickety-plunk, plunk, plunk, cotton bales, sweating black bodies. Sue, if he loves you, go with him. Tomorrow night, ladies and gentlemen, that magnificent comedy drama, Honest Hearts and Willing Hands. The band, red-coated, its brass screaming defiance at the noonday sun. The steely blue eyes and the pink face surrounded by the white wimple and the black coif seemed to be boring into her own eyes. "If you yourself would rather not have her here with us, we would prefer not to take her." "Oh, but I would, I do," Magnolia cried hastily. So it was arranged. Next week, Monday, half a dozen woolen this, half a dozen cotton that. Descending the great broad flight of outside steps, Magnolia said, like a child, "From now until Monday we'll do things, shall we? Fun. What would you like to do?" "Oh, matinee on Saturday," began Kim eagerly. Magnolia was enormously relieved. She had been afraid that this brief glimpse into the more spiritual life might already have had chastening effect upon the cosmopolitan Kim. Thus the child was removed from the pernicious atmosphere of the Chicago levee just when the levee itself began to feel the chastening hand of reform. Suddenly, overnight, Chicago went civic. For a quarter of a century, she had been a strident, apple-bosomed, loud-mouthed, Rabelaisian giantess in red satin and diamonds, who kept open house day and night and welcomed all comers. There were food and drink and cheer. Her great muscular arms embraced ranchers from Montana and farmers from Indiana and bankers from New York. At Bathhouse John's Working Men's Exchange, you got a tub of beer for a nickel. The stubble-faced bums lined the curb outside his ceaselessly swinging door on Clark Street. The visiting ranchers and farmers and bankers were told to go over to the Palmer House and see the real silver dollars sunk in the tiled floors of that hostelry's barroom. The garrulous Coughlin, known as the Bath, and the silent little hinky-dink Mike Kenna were Chicago's first ward alderman and her favorite naughty sons. The roulette wheels in Gambler's Alley spun merrily by day and by night. The mayor of the city called a genial, "Hope you're all winning, boys," as he dropped in for a sociable drink and a look at the play, or even to take a hand. "What'll you have?" was Chicago's greeting, and "Don't care if I do," her catchphrase. Hetty Chilson was the recognized leader of her sinister world, and that this world happened to be prefaced by the qualifying word "under" made little difference in Chicago's eyes. Pawn shops, saloons, dives, and gambling houses lined Clark Street from 12th to the river, and dotted the nearby streets for blocks around. The wind-burned ranchmen in bearskin coats and sombreros at Polk and Clark were as common a sight as the suave, white-fingered gentry in Prince Albert's and the diamonds at Clark and Madison. It was all one to Chicago. Game upstairs, gentlemen, game upstairs. New York, eyeing her western cousin through disapproving lorgnettes, said, "What a crude and vulgar person." "Me," blustered Chicago, dabbing futilely at the food and wine spots on her broad satin bosom. "Me, I'll learn you I'm a lady." The names of University of Chicago professors, economics department, began to appear on the lists of aldermanic candidates. Earnest young men and women with notebooks and fountain pens knocked at barred doors, stated that they were occupied in compiling a survey, and asked intimate questions. Down came whole blocks of rats' nest on Clark and Dearborn, with the rats scuttling frantically to cover up. Up went office buildings that actually sneered down upon the Masonic temple's boasted height. Brisk gentlemen in eyeglasses and sack suits whisked in and out of these chaste edifices. The clicking sound to be heard on Clark Street was no longer that of the roulette wheel, but of the stock market ticker and the Western Union transmitter. It was rumored that they were going to close Jeff Hankins. They were going to close Mike McDonald's. They were going to banish the Washington Park racetrack. "They can't do it," declared Gaylord Ravenel. "Oh, can't we?" sneered the reformers. Snick-snack went the bars on Hankins' door and on Mike McDonald's. It actually began to be difficult to find an open game. It began to be well nigh impossible. It came to such a pass that you had to know the signal knock. You had to submit to a silent scrutiny from unseen eyes peering through a slit somewhere behind a bland, closed door. The Prince Alberts grew shiny. The fine linen showed frayed edges. The diamonds reposed unredeemed for longer and longer periods at Lipman's or Goldsmith's. The Ravenel ring and the succession of sealskin sacks that seemed permanently to have passed out of the Ravenel possession. The Malacca stick, on the other hand, was now a fixture. It had lost its magic. It was no longer a symbol of security. The day was past when its appearance at Lipman's or Goldsmith meant an IOU for whatever sum Gay Ravenel's messenger might demand. There actually were mornings when even the cockeyed bakery represented luxury. As for breakfast at Billy Boyle's, an event. The Ravenels' past experience in Chicago seemed, in comparison with their present precarious position, a secure and even humdrum existence. Ohio and Ontario streets knew them for longer and longer periods. Now when Magnolia looked into the motley assemblage of objects in the more obscure pawnshop windows, she was likely to avert her eyes quickly at recognition of some object not only intimate, but familiar. Magnolia thought of Kim, safe, secure, comfortable, in the convent on Wabash Avenue. "I must have felt this thing coming," she said to Ravenel, "felt it in my bones. She's out of all this. It makes me happy just to think of it, to think of her there." "How are you going to keep her there?" demanded Ravenel gloomily. "I'm strapped. You might as well know it, if you don't already. I've had the damnedest run of luck." Magnolia's eyes grew wide with horror. "Keep her there, Gay. We've got to. I wouldn't have her knocking around here with us. Gay, can't you do something? Something real, I mean. Some kind of work like other, you're so wonderful. Aren't there things, positions, with banks, or those offices where they buy stocks and sell them and make money and wheat and things?" Lamely. Ravenel kissed her. "What a darling you are, Nola. A darling simpleton." It was a curious and rather terrible thing, this love bond between them. All that Parthe had grimly predicted had come to pass. Magnolia knew him for what he was. Often she hated him. Often he hated her. Often he hated her because she shamed him with her gaiety, her loyalty, her courage, her tenderness. He was not true to her. She knew this now. He knew she knew this. She was a one-man woman. Frequently they had quarreled hideously. "Tied to you, tied. God knows I'd be happier without you. You've never brought me anything but misery. Always finding fault, putting on those fine lady airs with me. What did I take you out of? An honest living, anyway. Look people in the face. Accusations, bitterness, longing, passion. The long periods of living in sordid surroundings made impossible most of the finer reticences. Garments washed out in the basin, food cooked over the gas jet. One room, one bed, badly balanced meals, reproaches, tears, sneers, laughter, understanding, reconciliation. They loved each other, over and above and through and beneath it all, thick and thin, warp and woof. They loved each other. It was when their fortunes were at lowest ebb, when the convent tuition had now been 2 terms unpaid, when the rent on the Ontario Street lodgings was overdue, when even Ravenel, handsome and morose, was forced to content himself with the coffee and rolls of the bedroom breakfast, when a stroll up Clark Street meant meeting a dozen McLean suits as shabby as his own. It was at this unpropitious time that Parthenia and Hawks was seized with the idea of visiting her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandchild in Chicago. Her letters always came to the Sherman House, had been called for there through these years, through the fluctuations in fortune that carried the Ravenels away from the hotel and back again with a tide-like regularity. Twice Magnolia had taken Kim to see her grim grandmama at Thebes when the cotton blossom was in for repairs during the winter season. These visits had always been timed when the Ravenel tide was high. Magnolia and Kim had come back to Thebes on the crest of a wave, foaming with silks and laces and plumes and furs. The visits could not, however, be said to have been a success. Magnolia always came prepared to be the fond and dutiful daughter. Invariably she left seething between humorous rage and angry laughter. "It wasn't anything she actually did," she would explain afterward ruefully to Ravenel. "It's just that she treats me with such disrespect." She pondered this a moment. "I honestly think Mama's the vainest woman I have ever met." Strangely enough, Kim and her grandmother did not get on very satisfactorily either. It dawned on Magnolia that the two were much alike. Their methods were different, but the results were the same. Each was possessed of an iron determination, boundless vitality, enormous resistance, canny foresight, definite ambition. Parthe was the blustering sort, Kim the quietly stubborn. When the two met in opposition, they stood braced, horn to horn, like bulls. On both occasions, these visits had terminated abruptly in less than a week. The bare, wind-swept little town, winter-locked, had seemed unspeakably dreary to Magnolia. In the chill parlor of the cottage there was a wooden portrait of her father done in crayon. It was an enlargement which Parthy had done from a small photograph of Andy in his blue coat and visored cap and baggy, wrinkled pants. An atrocious thing, but the artist, clumsy though he was, had somehow happened to catch the alert and fun-loving brightness of the keen brown eyes. The mutton-chop whiskers looked like tufts of dirty cotton. The cheeks were pink as a chorus girl's, but the eyes were Andy's. Magnolia wandered into the parlor to stand before this picture, looking up at it with a smile. She wandered, too, down to the river to gaze at the sluggish yellow flood, thick now with ice, but as enthralling as ever to her. She stood on the river bank in her rich furs, a lonely, wind-swept figure, gazing down the river, and her eyes that had grown so weary with looking always at great gray buildings and grim gray streets and swarming gray crowds now lost their look of strain, of unrepose, as they beheld in the far still distance the lazy southern wharves, the sleepy southern bayous, Cairo, Memphis, Vicksburg, Natchez, New Orleans, Queenie, Joe, Ellie, Schultze, Andy, Julie, Steve. She took Kim eagerly to the water's edge, gave her the river with a sweep of her arm. Kim did not like it. "Is that the river?" she asked. "Why, yes, darling. Don't you remember? The river. The river you told me about? Of course. It's all dirty and ugly. You said it was beautiful." "Oh, Kim, isn't it?" "No." She showed her the picture of Captain Andy. "Grandpa?" "Yes." "Captain?" "Yes, dear. He used to laugh. So when you called him that when you were a little baby, look at his eyes, Kim. Aren't they nice? He's laughing." "He's funny looking," said Kim. Parthy asked blunt questions. "Sherman House? What do you go living in a hotel for all these years, with the way they charge for food and all? You and that husband of yours must have money to throw away. Why don't you live in a house with your own things like civilized people?" "Gay likes hotels. Shiftless way to live. It must cost a mint of money." "It does," agreed Magnolia amiably. "Like to know where you get it, that's what. Gay is very successful." A snort as maddening as it was expressive from Parthy. The widow Hawks did not hesitate to catechize the child in the temporary absence of her mother. For these sessions, Parthy must have gained some knowledge of the Ohio and Ontario Street interludes, for she emerged from them with a look of grim satisfaction. And now Parthenia Ann Hawks was coming to Chicago. She had never seen it. The letter announced her arrival as 2 weeks distant. The showboat season was at an end. She would stay at the Sherman House where they were, if it wasn't too expensive. They were not to pay. She wouldn't be beholden to anyone. She might stay a week, she might stay 2 weeks, or longer, if she liked it. She wanted to see the stockyards, the Grand Opera House, the Masonic Temple, Marshall Fields, Lincoln Park, and the Chicago River. "My God," said Gaylord Ravenel almost piously. "My God!" Stricken, they looked at each other, stared. It was a thing beyond laughter. Every inch of space about them spelled failure. Just such failure as had been predicted for them by the woman who was now coming and whose coming would prove to her the triumph of that prediction. They were living in a huddle of discomfort on Ontario Street. Magnolia, on her visits to Kim at the convent, was hard put to it to manage the little surprise gift planned to bring to the girl's face the flashing look of gay expectancy. An Andriki cake elaborately iced to share with her intimates, a book, a pair of matinee tickets as a special treat, flowers for the Mother Superior, chocolates. Now the Christmas holidays were approaching. Kim would expect to spend them with her parents. But where? They would not bring her to this sordid lodging. And somehow, before the new term began, the unpaid tuition fee must be got together. Still, the Ravenels had faced such problems as these before now. They could have met them, they assured each other, as they always had. Luck always turned when things looked blackest. Life did that to tease you, but this was different. Gaylord Ravenel's world was crumbling. And Parthy, Here was a situation fraught with what of horror? Here was humiliation. Here was acknowledged defeat. Borrow, suggested Magnolia. On what security? I don't mean business-like borrowing. I mean borrowing from friends, all these men. Men, what men? The men at the places. They had always pretended that she did not actually know he came by his livelihood as he did. She never said Gambler's Alley. She refused to admit that daily he had disappeared within the narrow slit of a lane that was really a Clark Street alley, that he had spent the hours there watching bits of pasteboard for a living. The men you have known so many years. Grimly, they've all been trying to borrow from me. But Mike McDonald, Hankins, Varnell, the cast pretense aside now, thousands, they've had thousands of dollars. All the money we brought with us to Chicago, won't they give some of it back? This he found engaging rather than irritating, as well he might have. He shouted with laughter, as he always did, at a fresh proof of her almost incredible naivete. At times such as these, he invariably would be impelled to caress her, much as one laughs at a child and then fondles it delightedly after it has surprised one with an unexpected and charming trick. He would kiss the back of her neck and then her wide, flexible mouth, and she would push him away, bewildered and annoyed that this should be his reaction to what she had meant so seriously. Nola, you're priceless. You're a darling. There's no one like you. He went off again into a shout of laughter. Give it back, McDonald. Here's an idea for you. How can you act like this when you know how serious it is? Serious? Well, damn it, it's desperate. I tell you, I'll never have her come here and see us living like this. We'll get out first. Say, Nola, what's to prevent us getting out anyway? Chicago's no good anymore. Why not get out of this? I'm sick of this town. We haven't any money to get out with, for one reason. And Kim's at school, and she's going to stay there. And she's going to stay there if I have to what? Ask Mama for the money. She said this mischievously, troubled though she was. Out he flew into a rage. I'll see her in. I've been in deeper holes than this and managed to crawl out. He sat a moment in silence, staring with unseeing eyes at the shabby sticks of furniture that emphasized the room's dreariness. Magnolia, seated as quietly opposite him, sewing on a petticoat for Kim, suddenly let her hand sink in her lap. She realized with a sort of fright that he was as completely outside the room as though his body had been wafted magically through the window. And for him she, too, had vanished. He was deep in thought. The mask was off. She sat looking at him. She saw clearly the man her mother had so bitterly fought her marrying. The face of this man, now in his late 30s, was singularly unlined. Perhaps that was what you missed in it. The skin and hair and eyes, the set of the shoulders, the lead of the hand from the wrist bespoke a virile man. But vigorous, no, he was not that. This was a fencer, not a fighter. But he had fought for her years ago, the shambling preacher in the little river town whose name she had forgotten, that simple, ignorant soul who preached hellfire and thought that play actors were damned. He had not expected to be knocked down in his own musty little shop. Not much of a victory, that. Gay had opposed that iron woman, her mother, but the soft life since then. Red plush, rich food, Clark Street, weak. What was it? No lines about the mouth. Why was it weak? Why was it weak now if it had not been 12 years ago? A handsome man. Hard. But you couldn't be hard and weak at the same time, could you? What was he thinking of so intently? His face was so exposed, so defenseless, as sometimes when she awoke in the early morning and looked at him, asleep. Almost ashamed to look at his face, so naked was it of the customary daytime covering. Now resolve suddenly tightened it. He stood up. He adjusted the smart and shabby hat at an angle that defied its shabbiness. He reached for the Malacca stick. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. They had had a frugal and unappetizing meal at a little nearby lunchroom. Ravenel had eaten nothing. He had, for the most part, stared at the dishes with a detached and slightly amused air, as though they had been served him by mistake, and soon would be apologetically reclaimed by the slovenly waitress who had placed them before him. She had never been one to say, "Where are you going?" Yet now her face was so moving in its appeal that he answered its unspoken question. Cheer up, old girl. I know somebody. Who? Who, Gay? Somebody I've done favors for. She owes me a good turn. He was thinking aloud. She? Never mind. She, Gay? Did I say? Now, never mind, Nola. I'll do the worrying. He was off. She had become accustomed through these years to taking money without question when there was money, to doing without uncomplainingly when there was none. They had had to scheme before now, and scurry this way and that, seeking a way out of a tight corner. They had had to borrow as they had often lent. It had all been part of the Clark Street life, the gay, wasteful, lax, improvident sporting life of a crude, new Midwestern city. But that life was vanishing now. The city was vanishing with it. In its place, a newer, harder, more sophisticated metropolis was rearing its ambitious head. Magnolia, inured to money crises, realized that the situation tonight was different. This was not a crisis. It was an impasse. Let's get out of here, Gay had said. There was no way out. The men from whom he had borrowed in the past were themselves as harried as he. The sources from which he had gained his precarious livelihood were drying up. He almost ceased to exist, except furtively. I know somebody who would like to do me a favor, somebody who would like... A horrid suspicion darted through her mind. Released from the subconscious, appalled at its ugliness, she tried to send it back to its hiding place. It would not go. It stayed there before her mind's eye, grinning, evil, unspeakably repulsive. She took up her sewing again. She endeavored to fix her mind on Kim asleep in the cold, calm quiet of the great walled convent on South Wabash. French and embroidery and deportment and china painting and wimples and black wings and long, dark, shining halls and round white faces and slim white tapers and statues of the saints that turned into fawns, and why was that not surprising? A clatter. One of the saints had dropped her rosary on the bare, shining floor. It wasn't a rosary. It was an anchor ringing against the metal stanchion of the cotton blossom. Magnolia awoke. Her sewing scissors had fallen from her lap. Her face felt stiff and drawn. She hugged herself a little and shivered and looked about her. Her little gold watch on the dresser. No, of course not. That was gone. She folded her sewing. It was late, she knew. She was accustomed to being up until 12, 1, 2. But this was later. Something told her that this was later. The black hush of the city outside, the feel of the room in which she sat, the sinister quiet of the very walls about her. The cheap clock on the shelf had stopped. The hands said 20 minutes after 2, 21 minutes after, she told herself in a foolish triumph of precision. She took down her fine, long black hair, brushed it, plaited it, one of the lacy nightgowns so absurd in the sordid shabbiness of the rooming house bedroom, so alien to the coarse gray sheets. But she had no other kind. She went to bed. She fell asleep. It was just before dawn when he returned. The black of the window pane shone the promise of gray. His step had an unaccustomed sound. He fumbled for the gas jet. His very presence was strange in the dark. The light flared blue, but she knew even before it illuminated his face that bore queer, slack lines she had never before seen there. For the first time in their life together, Gaylord Ravenel was drunk. She sat up, reached for her wrapper at the foot of the bed and bunched it about her shivering shoulders. He was immensely serious and dignified. He swayed a little, the slack look on his face. That was all. I'll do the worrying, he said, as though continuing the conversation that had held them at 9 o'clock. He placed the malacca stick carefully in its corner. He removed his coat, keeping his hat on. The effect was startlingly rowdy, perhaps because he had always so meticulously observed the niceties. Standing thus, weaving back and forth ever so slightly, he pulled from his left vest pocket, where it fitted much too snugly, a plump bill folder. Custom probably cautioned him to retain this, merely widening its open side to reveal the sheaf of notes within. But his condition, with all that had gone to bring it about, caused him to forego his cunning. With a vague but successful gesture and a little lurch as he stood, he tossed the leather folder to the counterpane. "Count it," he commanded very distinctly. 10 $100 bills, and 10 $100 bills makes 20 $100 bills, and anybody says it doesn't is a liar. $2,000. Would you kindly count 'em, Miss Ravenal? I believe, with businesslike dignity. I believe you'll find that correct. Magnolia Ravenel, in her nightgown, with her wrapper hunched about her shoulders, sat staring at the little leather booklet on the bed. Its gaping mouth mocked her. She did not touch it. $2,000, she said. I believe you find that's correct. He seemed to be growing less distinct. Where did you get this, Gay? Never mind, I'll do the worrying. He unbuttoned his vest with some difficulty, yawned prodigiously like one who has earned the rest after a good day's work. She looked at him. She was like a drawing in a French ink, her face so white, her eyes so enormous, her hair so black. You got this from Hetty Chilson. His collar came off with a crack snap. He held it in the hand that pointed toward the money. He seemed offended at something, not angry, but hurt. How can you say that, Magnolia? I got 1,000 from good old Het and not sent more. What do I do then? March up to Sheedy's and win 1,000 more at roulette. Ha! That's a great joke on Sheedy, because look, roulette isn't my game. Never has been. Faro's my game. That's a gentleman's game, Faro. 1,000, Hetty, and march up, roulette, win another 1,000. He lurched into the bed. He was asleep at once, heavily, deeply beside her on the bed, his fine, long head lolling off the pillow. She knelt in her place and tried to lift the inert figure to a more comfortable position. Succeeded, finally, after some tugging. She drew the lumpy coverlet over him. Then she sat as before, hunched in her nightgown and the wrapper, staring at the open wallet with its many leaves. It was dawn now. The room was gray with it. She ought to be turning out the gas. She arose. She picked up the wallet. Before extinguishing the light, she counted out 10 $100 bills from the sheaf within the wallet. $1,000. Her fingers touched the bills gingerly, fastidiously, and a little wrinkle of disgust curled her lip. She placed the bills on the dresser. She folded the leather holder and tucked in with its remaining contents under his pillow. He did not waken. She turned out the light then, and coming back to the bedside, drew on the slippers that lay on the floor. She got her shirtwaist, a fresh white one with a Gibson tuck, from the drawer, and her skirt and jacket from the hooks covered over with a protecting length of calico against the wall. She heated a little water and washed, combed and dressed her hair, put on her clothes, laid her hat on the dresser. Then she sat in the one comfortable chair that the room afforded, a crazy and decayed armchair done in dingy red plush, relic of some past grandeur, and waited. She even slept a little there in the sagging old chair with the morning light glaring pitilessly in upon her face. When she awoke, it must have been nearly noon, a dour day. But she had grown accustomed to the half-lights of the Chicago fogs. She glanced sharply at him. He had not moved. He had not stirred. He looked somehow young, helpless, innocent, pathetic. She busied herself in making a cup of coffee as quietly as might be. This might rouse him, but it would make little difference. She knew what she had to do. She drank the hot, revivifying liquid in great gulps. Then she put on her jacket, pinned on her hat, took up the bills, and placed them neatly in her handbag. She glanced at herself in the mirror. My, you're plain, she thought, meaninglessly. She went down the dim stairway. The fusty landlady was flapping a gray rag in the outer doorway as her contribution to the grime of the street. What's taking you out so bright and early, Miss Ravenel? Business or pleasure? She liked her little joke. Business, said Magnolia. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by J. Randolph. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 17. The knell had sounded for the red brick house with the lions guarding its portals. The Chicago soot hung like a pall over it. The front steps sagged. Even the stone lions had a mangy look. The lemon-water sunshine of a Chicago winter day despoiled the dwelling of any sinister exterior aspect. That light, filtering through the lake mist, gave to the house front the look of a pock-marked, wrinkled, and evil old hag who squats in the marketplace with her face to the sun and thinks of her purple past and does not regret it. It was 1:30. Magnolia Ravenal had figured this out nicely. That part of Clark Street would be astir by now. As she approached the house on Clark, near Polk, her courage had momentarily failed her, and she had passed it hurriedly. She had walked a block south, wretchedly. But the feel of the bills in her bag gave her new resolve. She opened the handbag to look at them, turned, and walked swiftly back to the house. She rang the bell this time, firmly, demandingly, stood looking down at its clean scrubbed doorstep, and tried to ignore the prickling sensation that ran up and down her spine, and the weak and trembling feeling in her legs. The people passing by could see her. She was knocking at Hetty Chilson's notorious door, and the people passing by could see her, Magnolia Ravenal. Well, what of it? Don't be silly. She rang again. The door was opened by a Negro in a clean, starched white housecoat. Magnolia did not know why the sight of this rather sad-eyed-looking black man should have reassured her, but it did. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. "My name is Mrs. Ravenal. I want to speak to Hetty Chilson." "Mrs. Chilson's busy, ma'am," he said, as though repeating a lesson. Still, something about the pale, well-dressed, earnest woman evidently impressed him. Of late, when he opened the door, there had been frequent surprises for him in the shape of similar earnest and well-dressed young women who, when you refused them admittance, flashed an official-looking badge, whipped out notebook and pencil, and insisted pleasantly but firmly that he make quite sure Miss Chilson was not in. "You all one of them surveys?" Uncomprehending, she shook her head. He made as though to shut the door, gently. Magnolia had not spent years in the South for nothing. "Don't you shut that door on me. I want to see Hetty Chilson." The man recognized the tone of white authority. "What you want?" Magnolia recovered herself. After all, this was not the front door of a home, but of a house. "Tell her Mrs. Gaylord Ravenal wants to speak to her. Tell her that I have $1,000 that belongs to her, and I want to give it to her." Foolishly, she opened the bag, and he saw the neat sheaf of bills. His eyes popped a little. "Yes'm, I'll tell her. Step in, ma'am." Magnolia entered Hetty Chilson's house. She was frightened. The trembling had taken hold of her knees again. But she clutched the handbag and looked about her, frankly curious. A dim hallway, richly carpeted, its walls covered with a red satin brocade. There were deep, soft cushioned chairs, and others of carved wood, high-backed. A lighted lamp on the stairway newel post cast a rosy glow over the whole. Huge Sevres vases stood in the stained-glass window niches. It was an entrance hall such as might have been seen in the Prairie Avenue or Michigan Avenue house of a new, rich Chicago packer. The place was quiet. Now and then you heard a door shut. There was the scent of coffee in the air. No footfall on the soft carpet, even though the tread were heavy. Hetty Chilson descended the stairs, a massive, imposing figure in a black and white patterned foulard dress. She gave the effect of activity hampered by some physical impediment. Her descent was one of impatient deliberateness. One hand clung to the railing. She appeared a stout, middle-aged, well-to-do householder summoned from some domestic task above stairs. She had aged much in the last 10 years. Magnolia, startled, realized that the distortion of her stout figure was due to a tumor. "How do you do?" said Hetty Chilson. Her keen eyes searched her visitor's face. The Negro hovered nearby in the dim hallway. "Are you Mrs. Ravenal?" "Yes." "What is it, please?" Magnolia felt like a schoolgirl interrogated by a stern but well-intentioned preceptress. Her cheeks were burning as she opened her handbag, took out the sheaf of $100 bills, tendered them to this woman. "The money," she stammered, "the money you gave my husband. Here it is." Hetty Chilson looked at the bills. "I didn't give it to him. I loaned it to him. He said he'd pay it back, and I believe he will. Ravenal's got the name for being square." Magnolia touched Hetty Chilson's hand with the folded bills, pressed them on her so that the hand opened automatically to take them. "We don't want it." "Don't want it? Well, what'd he come asking me for it for, then? I'm no bank that you can take money out and put money in." "I'm sorry. He didn't know. I can't take it." Hetty Chilson looked down at the bills. Her eyeglasses hung on the bodice of her dress, near the right shoulder, attached to a patent gold chain. This she pulled out now with a businesslike gesture and adjusted the eyeglasses to her nose. "Oh, you're that kind, huh?" She counted the bills once and then again, folded them. "Does your husband know about this?" Magnolia did not answer. She looked dignified and felt foolish. The very matter-of-factness of this world-hardened woman made this thing Magnolia had done seem overdramatic and silly. Hetty Chilson glanced over her shoulder to where the white-coated Negro stood. "Mose, tell Jewel I want her. Tell her to bring her receipt book and a pen." Mose ran up the soft-carpeted stairs. You heard a deferential rap at an upper door. Voices. Hetty turned again to Magnolia. "You'll want a receipt for this. Anyway, you'll have that to show him when he kicks up a fuss." She moved ponderously to the foot of the stairway, waited a moment there, looking up. Magnolia's eyes followed her gaze. Mose had vanished, evidently, down some rear passage and stairway, for he again appeared mysteriously at the back of the lower hall, though he had not descended the stairway up which he had gone a moment before. Down this stair came a straight, slim, gray-haired figure. Genteel was the word that popped into Magnolia's mind. A genteel figure, in decent black silk, plain and good. It rustled discreetly. A fine white turnover collar finished it at the throat, narrow cuffs at the wrist. It was difficult to see her face in the dim light. She paused a moment in the glow of the hall lamp as Hetty Chilson instructed her. A white face, no, not white, ivory, like something dead. White hair still faintly streaked with black. In this clearer light the woman seemed almost gaunt. The eyes were incredibly black in that ivory face, like dull coals, Magnolia thought, staring at her, fascinated. Something in her memory stirred at the sight of this woman in the garb of a companion secretary and with a face like burned-out ashes. Perhaps she had seen her with Hetty Chilson at the theater or the races. She could not remember. "Make out a receipt for $1,000 received from Mrs. Gaylord Ravenal. Ravenal. Yes, that's right. Here, I'll sign it." Hetty Chilson penned her name swiftly as the woman held the book for her. She turned to Magnolia. "Excuse me," she said. "I have to be at the bank at 2. Jewel, give this receipt to Mrs. Ravenal. Come up as soon as you're through." With a kind of ponderous dignity, this strange and terrible woman ascended her infamous stairway. Magnolia stood, watching her. Her plump, well-shaped hand clung to the railing. An old woman, her sins heavy upon her. She had somehow made Magnolia feel a fool. The companion tore the slip of paper from the booklet, advanced to Magnolia, and held it out to her. $1,000, she said. Her voice was deep and rich and strange. "Mrs. Gaylord Ravenal, correct?" Magnolia put out her hand, blindly. Unaccountably, she was trembling again. The slip of paper dropped from her hand. The woman uttered a little exclamation of apology. They both stooped to pick it up as the paper fluttered to the floor. They bumped awkwardly, actually laughed a little, ruefully, and, straightening, looked at each other, smiling. And as Magnolia smiled, shyly, she saw the smile on the face of the woman freeze into a terrible contortion of horror. Horror stamped itself on her every feature. Her eyes were wild and enormous with it. Her mouth gaped with it. So the two stood staring at each other for one hideous moment. Then the woman turned, blindly, and vanished up the stairs like a black ghost. Magnolia stood staring after her. Then, with a little cry, she made as though to follow her up the stairway. Strangely, she cried, "Julie, Julie, wait for me!" Mose, the negro, came swiftly forward. "This way out, miss," he said deferentially. He held the street door open. Magnolia passed through it, down the steps of the brick house with the lion's couchant, into the midday brightness of Clark Street. Suddenly she was crying, who so rarely wept. South Clark Street paid little attention to her, inured as it was to queer sights, and if a passer-by had stopped and said, "What is it? Can I help you?" she would have been at a loss to reply. Certainly she could not have said, "I think I have just seen the ghost of a woman I knew when I was a little girl, a woman I first saw when I was swinging on the gate of our house at Thebes, and she went by in a long-tailed, flounced black dress and a lace veil tied around her hat, and I last saw her. Oh, I can't be sure. I can't be sure. It might not—" Clark Street, even if it had understood, which is impossible, would not have been interested. And presently, as she walked along, she composed herself. She dabbed her face with her handkerchief and pulled down her neat veil. She had still another task to perform. But the day seemed already so old. She was not sleepy, but her mind felt thick and slow. The events of the past night and of the morning did not stand out clearly. It was as if they had happened long ago. Perhaps she should eat something. She had had only that cup of coffee, had eaten almost nothing the night before. She had a little silver in her purse. She counted it as it lay next to the carefully folded $1,000 receipt signed in Hetty Chilson's firm, businesslike hand. 25, 35, 40, 50, 73 cents. Ample. She stopped at a lunchroom on Harrison, near Wabash, ate a sandwich, and drank 2 cups of coffee. She felt much better. On leaving, she caught a glimpse of herself in a wall mirror, a haggard woman with a skin blotched from tears and a shiny nose, and with little untidy wisps of hair showing beneath her hat. Her shoes. She remembered having heard or read somewhere that neat shoes were the first requisite for an applicant seeking work. Furtively and childishly, she rubbed the toe of either shoe on the back of each stocking. She decided to go to one of the department store restrooms for women, and there repair her toilette. Fields was the nicest, the Boston store the nearest. She went up State Street to Fields. The white marbled mirror room was full of women. It was warm and bright and smelled pleasantly of powder and soap and perfume. Magnolia took off her hat, bathed her face, tidied her hair, powdered. Now she felt less alien to these others about her, these comfortable, chattering, shopping women, wives of husbands who worked in offices, who worked in shops, who worked in factories. She wondered about them. She was standing before a mirror, adjusting her veil, and a woman was standing beside her, peering into the same glass, each seemingly oblivious of the other. I wonder, Magnolia thought fancifully, what she would say if I were to turn to her and tell her that I used to be a showboat actress, and that my father was drowned in the Mississippi, and my mother, at 60, runs a showboat all alone, and that my husband is a gambler, and we have no money, and that I have just come from the most notorious brothel in Chicago, where I returned $1,000 my husband had got there, and that I'm on my way to try to get work in a variety theater. She was smiling a little at this absurd thought. The other woman saw the smile, met it with a frozen stare of utter respectability, and walked away. There were few theatrical booking offices in Chicago, and these were of doubtful reputation. Magnolia knew nothing of their location, though she thought vaguely that they probably would be somewhere in the vicinity of Clark, Madison, Randolph. She was wise enough in the ways of the theater to realize that these shoddy agencies could do little for her. She had heard Ravenal speak of the variety houses and museums on State Street and Clark and Madison. The word vaudeville was just coming into use. In company with her husband, she had even visited Cole and Middleton's museum, that smoke-filled, comfortable, shabby variety house on Clark, where the admission was 10 cents. It had been during that first Chicago trip, before Kim's birth. Women seldom were seen in the audience, but Ravenal, for some reason, had wanted her to get a glimpse of this form of theatrical entertainment. Here Weber and Fields had played for $15 a week. Here you saw the funny Irishman, Eddie Foy, and May Howard had sung and danced. They'll probably build big expensive theaters someday for variety shows, Ravenal had predicted. The performance was, Magnolia thought, much like that given as the concert after the evening's bill on the Cotton Blossom. A whole evening of that, she said. Years later, the Masonic Temple roof was open for vaudeville. There, Ravenal had triumphantly exclaimed. What did I tell you? Some of those people get $300 and $400 a week, and even more. Here the juggling August family threw plates and lighted lamps and tables and chairs, and ended by keeping aloft a whole dinner service and parlor suite, with lamps, soup tureens, and plush chairs passing each other affably in midair without mishap. Jessie Bartlett Davis sang, sentimentally, "True love, that's the simple charm that opens every woman's heart." At the other end of the scale were the all-night restaurants, with a stage at the rear where the waiters did an occasional song and dance, or where some amateur tried to prove his talent. Between these were 2 or 3 variety shows of decent enough reputation, though frequented by the sporting world of Chicago. Chief of these was Jopper's Varieties, a basement theater on Wabash, supposed to be copied after the Criterion in London. There was a restaurant on the ground floor. A flight of marble steps led down to the underground auditorium. Here new acts were sometimes tried out. Lillian Russell, it was said, had got her first hearing at Jopper's. For some reason, Magnolia had her mind fixed on this place. She made straight for it, probably as unbusinesslike a performer as ever presented herself for a hearing. It was now well on toward mid-afternoon. Already the early December dusk was gathering, aided by the Chicago smoke and the lake fog. Her fright at Hetty Chilson's door was as nothing compared to the sickening fear that filled her now. She was physically and nervously exhausted. The false energy of the morning had vanished. She tried to goad herself into fresh courage by thoughts of Kim at the convent, of Parthy's impending visitation. As she approached the place on Wabash, she resolved not to pass it weakly. If she passed it but once, she would never have the bravery to turn and go in. She and Ravenal had driven by many times on their way to the South Side races. It was in this block. It was 4 doors away. It was here. She wheeled stiffly like a soldier and went in. The restaurant was dark and deserted. One dim light showed at the far end. The tablecloths were white patches in the grayness. But a yellow path of light flowed up the stairway that led to the basement, and she heard the sound of a piano. She descended the swimming marble steps, aware of the most alarming sensation in her legs. Rather, of no sensation in them. It was as though no solid structure of bone and flesh and muscle lay in the region between her faltering feet and her pounding heart. There was a red-carpeted foyer, a little ticket window. The doors of the auditorium stood open. She put out a hand, blindly, to steady herself against the door jamb. She looked into the theater, the badly lighted, empty theater, with its rows and rows of vacant seats, its stage at the far end, the curtain half raised, the set a crudely painted interior. As she looked, there came over her, flowed over her like balm, a feeling of security, of peace, of homecoming. Here were accustomed surroundings. Here were the very sights and smells and sounds she knew best. Those men with their hats on the backs of their heads and their cigars waggling comfortably and their feet on the chair in front of them might have been Schultze, Frank, Ralph, Pa means. Evidently a song was being tried out in rehearsal. The man at the piano was hammering it and speaking the words in a voice as hoarse and unmusical as a boat whistle coming through the fog. It was a coon song full of "my babies" and "choo-choos" and "Alabams." Magnolia waited quietly until he had come to a full stop. A thin, pale young man in a striped shirt and a surprising gray derby, who had been sitting with his wooden kitchen chair tipped up against the proscenium, now brought his chair down on all fours. "You was with Haverly's, you say?" "I certainly was. Ask Jim. Ask Sam. Ask anybody." "Well, go back to 'em, is what I say. If you ever was more than a singin' waiter, then I'm new to the show business." He took his coat from where it lay on top of the piano. "That's all for today, ain't it, Joe?" He addressed a large huddle whose thick shoulders and round head could just be seen above the back of a second-row center seat. The fat huddle rose and stretched and yawned and grunted an affirmative. Magnolia came swiftly down the aisle. She looked up at the thin young man. He stared at her across the footlight gutter. "Will you let me try some songs?" she asked. "Who are you?" demanded the young man. "My name is Magnolia Ravenal." "Never heard of it. What do you do?" "I sing. I sing Negro songs with a banjo." "All right," said the thin young man resignedly. "Get out your banjo and sing us one." "I haven't got one." "Haven't got one what?" "A banjo." "Well, you said didn't you just say you sung nigger songs with a banjo?" "I haven't got one with me. Isn't there one?" Actually, until this moment, she had not given the banjo a thought. She looked about her in the orchestra pit. "Well, for God's sakes," said the gray derby. The hoarse-voiced singer, who had just met with rebuff and who was shrugging himself into a shabby overcoat, now showed himself a knight. He took an instrument case from the piano top. "Here," he said. "Take mine, sister." Magnolia looked to left, to right. "There!" The fat man in the second row jerked a thumb toward the right stage box, back of which was the stage door. Magnolia passed swiftly up the aisle, was on the stage. She was quite at ease, relaxed, at home. She seated herself in one of the deal chairs, crossed her knees. "Take your hat off," commanded the pasty young man. She removed her hat and veil. A sallow, big-eyed young woman, too thin, in a well-made suit and a modest, rather crumpled shirt-waist, and nothing of the look of the stage about her. She thumbed the instrument again. She remembered something dimly, far, far back, and yet very recent, this morning. Don't smile too often, but if you ever want anything... She smiled. The young man did not appear overwhelmed. She threw back her head, then, as Joe had taught her, half closed her eyes, tapped time with the right foot smartly. Imitative in this, she managed, too, to get into her voice that soft and husky Negro quality which for years she had heard on riverboats, bayous, landings. "I got a wings. You got a wings. All God's chillun got wings." "Sing another," said the old young man. She sang the one she had always liked best. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." Husky, mournful, melodious voice, tapping foot, rolling eye. Silence. "What kind of coon song do you call that?" inquired the gray derby. "Why, it's a Negro melody. They sing them in the South." "Sounds like a church hymn to me." He paused. His pale, shrewd eyes searched her face. "You a nigger?" The unaccustomed red surged into Magnolia's cheeks, dyed her forehead, her throat, painfully. "No, I'm not a nigger." "Well, you certainly sing like one. Voice and, I don't know, way you sing. Ain't that right, Joe?" "Certainly is," agreed Joe. The young man appeared a trifle embarrassed, which made him look all the younger. Years later, in New York, Kim was to know him as one of the most powerful theatrical producers of his day. And he was to say to Kim, "Ravenal, Why, say, I knew your mother when she was better looking than you'll ever be, and smart. Say, she tried to sell me a coon song turned down in Joppers in the old days, long before your time. I thought they were hymns and wouldn't touch them. Seems they're hot stuff now. Spirituals, they call 'em. You hear 'em in every show on Broadway. It's a fact. Got to go to church to get away from 'em. Well, live and learn's what I say. It was through this shrewd, tough, stage-wise boy that Magnolia had her chance. He did not understand or like her Negro folk songs then, but he did recognize the quality she possessed, and it was due to this precociousness in him that Magnolia, a little more than a year later, was singing American coon songs in the Masonic Roof Bill, her name on the program with those of Cissy Loftus and Marshall Wilder and the Four Cohans. But now she stood up, the scarlet receding from her face, leaving it paler than before. Silently she handed the husky singer his banjo, tried to murmur a word of thanks, choked. She put on her hat, adjusted her veil. "Here, wait a minute, sister. No offense. I've seen 'em lighter than you. Your voice sounds like a... Ain't that the truth, Joe?" Actually distressed, he appealed again to his unloquacious ally in the third row. "Sure does," agreed Joe. The unfortunate hoarse-voiced man who had loaned her the banjo now departed. He seemed to bear no rancor. Magnolia, seeing this, tried again to smile on the theory that, if he could be game, then so too could she. And this time it was the real Magnolia Ravenal smile of which the newspapers made much in the years to come. The ravishing Ravenal smile, they said, someone having considered that alliterative phrase rather neat. Seeing it now, the young showman exclaimed without too much elegance, "Look at that, Joe!" Then to Magnolia, "Listen, sister, you won't get far with those. Your songs are too much like church tunes, see? They're for a funeral, not a theater, and that's a fact. But I like the way you got a singing 'em. How about singing me a real coon song, you know, 'Hello, my baby,' or something like that?" "I don't know any. These are the only songs I know." "Well, listen, you learn some real coon songs and come back, see, in a week. Here, try these over at home, see?" He selected some song sheets from the accommodating piano top. She took them numbly. She was again in the cold, moist winter street. Quite dark now. She walked over to State Street and took a northbound car. The door of their room on the third floor was locked, and when she opened it she felt that the room was empty. Not empty merely, deserted. Before she had lighted the gas jet she had an icy feeling of desolation, of impending and piled-up tragedy at the close of a day that had already toppled with it. Her gaze went straight to the dresser. An envelope was there, her name on it in Ravenel's neat, delicate hand. "Magnolia, darling, I am going away for a few weeks. Return when your mother is gone, or send for you. $600 for you on shelf under a clock. Kim, convent, enough. Weeks. Darling, love, best, always." She never saw him again. She must have been a little light-headed by this time, for certainly no deserted wife in her right senses would have followed the course that Magnolia Ravenal now took. She read the note again, her lips forming some of the words aloud. She walked to the little painted shelf over the washstand. 600. That was right. 600. Perhaps this really belonged to that woman, too. She couldn't go there again. Even if it did, she couldn't go there again. She left the room, the gas flaring. She hurried down Clark Street, going a few blocks south, into one of the pawn shops. That was nothing new. The man actually greeted her by name. "Good evening, Mrs. Ravenal. And what can I do for you?"
"A banjo."
"What?"
"I want to buy a banjo."
She bargained for it shrewdly. When she tendered $100 bill in payment, the man's face fell. "Oh, now, Mrs. Ravenal, I gave you that special price because I'll go somewhere else. She got it. Hurried back with it. Into her room again. She had not even locked the door. 5 of the 6 $100 bills lay as she had tossed them on the dresser. A little crazy, certainly. Years afterward, she actually could relate the fantastic demoniac events of this day that had begun at 4 in the morning and ended almost 20 hours later. It made a very good story. Dramatic, humorous, tragic. Kim's crowd thought it was wonderful. She took off her veil and hat and jacket. Her black hair lay in loose, limp, ugly loops about her face. She opened one of the sheets of music, Whose Black Baby Are You?, and propped it up against the center section of the old-fashioned dresser. She crossed her knees, cradled a banjo, one foot tapping the time rhythmically. An hour, 2 hours. A knock at the door. The landlady, 12 hours fustier than she had been that morning. "It ain't me, Miss Ravenal, but downstairs says she can't sleep for the noise. She's that sickly one. She says she pounded, but you didn't." "I'll stop. I didn't hear her. I'm sorry." "For me, you could go on all night." The landlady leaned bulkily and sociably against the door. "I'm crazy about music. I never knew you was musical." "Oh, yes," said Magnolia. "Very." End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 18. "I was educated," began Kim Ravenal, studying her reflection in the mirror and deftly placing a dab of rouge on either earlobe, "in Chicago by the dear sisters there in St. Agatha's Convent." She then had the grace to snigger, knowing well what the young second assistant dramatic critic would say to that. She was being interviewed in her dressing room at the booth between the second and third acts of Needles and Pins. She had opened in this English comedy in October. Now it was April. Her play before this had run a year. Her play before that had run 2 years. Her play, well, there was nothing new to be said in an interview with Kim Ravenal, no matter how young or how dramatic the interviewer. There was, therefore, a touch of mischievous malice in this trite statement of hers. She knew what the bright young man would say in protest. He said it. He said, "Oh, now, Pete's sakes, Miss Ravenal, quit kidding." "But I was. I can't help it. I was. Ask my mother. Ask my husband. Ask anybody. Educated by the dear sisters in the Oh, I know it. So does everybody else who reads the papers. And you know as well as I do that educated in a convent stuff is rubber stamp. It ceased to be readable publicity when Miss Siddons was a gal. Now be reasonable. Kaufman wants a bright piece about you for the Sunday page. All right. You ask intelligent questions, and I'll answer them." Kim then leaned forward to peer intently at her own reflection in the dressing-room mirror, with its brilliant border of amber lights. She reached for the rabbit's foot and applied to her cheeks that nervous and redundant film of rouge, which means that the next curtain is 4 minutes away. He was a very cagey New York second assistant dramatic critic who did not confine his talents to second assistant dramatic criticism. The pages of Vanity Fair and The New Yorker, locally known as the Fly Papers, frequently accepted first assistant dramatic aid from his pen, and naturally he had written one of those expressionistic plays so daringly different that 3 intrepid managers had decided not to put it in after all. Embittered, the second assistant dramatic critic threatened sardonically to get a production through the ruse of taking up residence in Prague or Budapest, changing his name to Capek or Vajda, and sending his manuscript back to New York as a foreign play for them to fight over. Though she had now known New York for many years, there were phases of its theatrical life that still puzzled Kim's mother, Magnolia Ravenal. And this was one of them. "The critics all seem to write plays," she complained. "It makes the life of a successful actress like Kim so complicated. And the actors and actresses all lecture
on the trend of the modern drama at league luncheons given at Astor. I went to one once, with Kim. Blue voile ladies from Inglewood. In my day, critics criticized and actors acted. Her suave and gifted son-in-law, Kenneth Cameron, himself a producer of plays of the more precious pattern, The Road to Sunrise 1921, Jocko Dreams 1924, teased her gently about this attitude of intolerance. Why, Nola, and you, a famous stage mama, you ought to know that even Kim occasionally has to do things for publicity. In my Cotton Blossom days, we were more subtle. The band marched down Main Street and played on the corner, and Papa gave out handbills. That was our publicity. I didn't have to turn handsprings up the levee. There was little that the public did not know about Kim Ravenal. There was nothing that the KG young assistant critic did not know. He assumed a tone of deep bitterness. All right, my fine lady, I'll go back and write a pattern piece. Started in stock in Chicago, went to New York National Theater School, star pupil and teacher's pet while there, got a bit in Mufti, wasn't it? And walked away with the play just like the aspiring young actress in a bum short story. Born on a showboat in Kentucky and Illinois and Missouri simultaneously. Say, explain that to me sometime, will you? Hence name of Kim. Also, mother was a showboat actress and later famous singer of coon. Say, where is that mother of yours these days anyway? Gosh, I think she's grand. I'm stuck on her. She's the burning passion of my youth. No kidding. I don't know, she's got that kind of haunted, hungry, ed-up look like Bernhardt or Doucet or one of them. You've got a little of it yourself. Oh, sir, murmured Kim gratefully. Cultivate it, is my advice. And when she smiles, boy, I work like a dog to get her to smile whenever I see her. She thinks I'm one of those cut-ups. I'm really a professional suicide at heart, but I'd wiggle my ears if it would win one of those slow, dazzling. Listen, who or whom are you interviewing, young man? Me or my mama? She around? No, she's at the Shaw opening with Ken. Well then, you'll do. Just for that, I think I'll turn elegant on you and not grant any more interviews. Maud Adams never did. Look at Mrs. Fisk. And Doucet. Anyway, interviews always sound so dumb when they appear in print. Dignified silence is the thing. Mystery. Everyone knows too much about the stage nowadays. Believe me, I do, said the young second assistant dramatic critic, in a tone of intense acerbity. A neat little triple tap at the dressing room door. Curtain already? Exclaimed Kim in a kind of panic. You would have thought this was her first stage summons. Another hasty application with the rabbit's foot. A mulatto girl in black silk so crisp, and white batiste cap and apron so correct that she might have doubled as stage and practical maid, now opened the door outside, which she had been discreetly stationed. Curtain, Blanche? Half a minute more, Miss Ravenal. Telegram. She handed a yellow envelope to Kim. As Kim read it, there settled over her face the rigidity of shock, so plain that the second assistant dramatic critic almost was guilty of. No bad news, I hope. But as though he had said it, Kim Ravenal handed him the slip of paper. They've misspelled it, she said irrelevantly. It ought to be Parthenia. He read, Mrs. Partha A. Hawks died suddenly. 8 o'clock before evening show. Cotton Blossom, playing Cold Spring, Tennessee. Advise Sympathy Company. Chaz K. Barnado. Hawks? My grandmother. I'm sorry. Lamely. Is there anything? I haven't seen her in years. She was very old, over 80. I can't quite realize. She was famous on the rivers, a sort of legendary figure. She owned and managed the Cotton Blossom. There was a curious kind of feud between her and mother and my father. She was really a pretty terrible. I wonder, mother. Curtain, Miss Ravenal. She went swiftly toward the door. Can I do anything? Fetch your mother from the theater? She'll be back here with Ken after the play. Half an hour. No use. He followed her as she went swiftly toward the door, from which she made her third act entrance. "I don't want to be offensive, Miss Ravenal, but if there's a story in this, your grandmother, I mean 80, you know." Over her shoulder in a whisper, "There is. See Ken." She stood for a moment, seemed to set her whole figure, relaxed it, then vanished. You heard her lovely but synthetic voice as the American wife of the English husband in the opening lines of her third act. "I'm so sick of soggy British breakfast. Deviled kidneys, ugh! Who but the English could face food so visceral at 9 a.m.? She was thinking as she played the third act for the 300th time that she must tuck the telegram under a cold cream jar, or back of her mirror as soon as she returned to her dressing room. What if Magnolia should take it into her head to leave the Shaw play early and find it there on her dressing table? She must tell her gently. Magnolia never had learned to take telegrams calmly. They always threw her into a panic. Ever since that one about Gaylord Ravenal's death in San Francisco. Gaylord Ravenal, a lovely name. What a tin-horn sport he must have been. Charming, though, probably. Curtain, bows. Curtain, bows. Curtain, bows, curtain. She was back in her dressing room, had removed her makeup, was almost dressed when Ken returned with her mother. She had made desperate haste, aided expertly by her maid. The two entered, laughing, talking, bickering good-naturedly. Kim heard her husband's jejune plangent voice outside her dressing-room door. "I'm going to tell your daughter on you, Nola. Yes, I am." "I don't care. He started it." Kim looked around at them. Why need they be so horribly high-spirited just tonight? It was like comedy relief in a clumsily written play, put in to make the tragedy seem deeper. Still, this news was hardly tragic, yet her mother might. For years now, Kim Ravenal had shielded her mother, protected her, spoiled her, Magnolia said almost resentfully. She stood now with her son-in-law in the cruel glare of the dressing-room lights. Her face was animated, almost flushed. Her fine head rose splendidly from the furred frame of her luxurious coat collar. Her breast and throat were firm and creamy above the square-cut décolletage of her black gown. Her brows looked the blacker and more startling for the wing of white that crossed the black of her straight, thick hair. There was about this woman, past middle age, a breathtaking vitality. Her distinguished young son-in-law appeared rather anemic in contrast. "How was the play?" Kim asked, possibly in hope of changing their ebullient mood. "Nice production," said Cameron. "Lunch was flawless. Fontaine's turned just a shade cute on us. She'd better stop that. Shaw revived. Tastes a little moldy." Wesley yelled. Simonson's set were, meticulous, I think the word is. "And I want to inform you, my dear Mrs. C., that your mamma has been a very naughty girl." This would never do, thought Kim, her mind on the yellow envelope. She put her arm around her mother. "Kiss me and I'll forgive you," she said. "You don't know what she's done." "Whatever it is." "Woolcott started it anyway," protested Magnolia Ravenal, lighting her cigarette. "I should think a man who's dramatic critic of the New York World would have more consideration for the dignity of his—" Cameron took up the story. "Our seats turned out to be next to his. Nola sat between us. You know how she always clutches somebody's hand during the emotional scenes. The last time I went to the theater with Woolcott, he said he'd slap my hands hard if I ever again," put in Magnolia. But Cameron once more interrupted. "Then, in the second act, she clutched him instead of me, and he slapped her hand. And pinched. And Nola gave him a sharp dig in the stomach, I'm afraid, with her elbow, and there was quite a commotion. Mothers-in-law are a terrible responsibility." "Mother dear, a first night of a Shaw revival at the National?" "He started it, but anyway, you've brought me up wrong." There was about her suddenly a curious effect of weariness. It was as if though until now she had been acting, and had discarded her role. She stood up. "Ken, if you'll get me a taxi, I'll run along home. I'm tired." "You two are going to the Swopes, aren't you? That means 3 o'clock." "I'm not going," said Kim. "Wait a minute, Ken." She came over to Magnolia. "Mother, I just got a telegram." "Mama?" She uttered the word as if she were a little girl. "Yes. Where is it?" Kim indicated it. There, Ken, get it for me, will you? Under the makeup tray. Dead? Magnolia had not unfolded the yellow slip. Yes. She read it. She looked up. The last shadow had vanished of that mood in which she had entered 10 minutes earlier. She looked suddenly sallow and 60. Let me see. Tennessee, trains. But not tonight, Mother. Yes. Ken, there's something to St. Louis, Memphis, I'm sure. And then from there tomorrow morning. Ken will go with you. No. Sharply. No. She had her way in the end. Left that night and alone, over Kim's protests and Ken's. If I need you, Ken dear, I'll telegraph. All of those people in the troupe, you know, some of them have been with her for 10 years, 15. All sorts of trains before you reached this little remote town. Little dusty red plush trains with sociable brakemen and passengers whose clothes and bearing now seemed almost grotesque to the eye that once had looked upon them without criticism. A long, hard, trying journey. Little towns at which you left this train and waited long hours for the next. Cinder-strewn junctions whose stations were little better than sheds. Mile after mile, the years had receded as New York was left behind. The sandy soil of the South, little straggling villages, unpainted, weather-stained cabins, black as the faces that peered from their doorways. When Magnolia Ravenal caught the first gleam of April dogwood flashing white in the forest depths as the train bumbled by, her heart gave a great leap. In a curious and dreamlike way, the years of her life with Ravenal in Chicago, the years following Ravenal's desertion of her there, the years of Magnolia's sudden success in New York seemed to fade into unreality. They became unimportant, fragmentary interludes. This was her life. She had never left it. They would be there, Julie and Steve, and Wendy and Doc and Parthy and Andy and Schulze. Somehow, they would be there. They were real. The others were dream people. Mike McDonald, Hankins, Hetty Chilson, all that Ratfish Chicago crew. The New York group, Kim's gay, fly, brittle, brilliant crowd, with which Magnolia had always assumed an ease she did not feel. She decided sensibly that she was tired, a little dazed even. She had slept scarcely at all the night before. Perhaps this news of her mother's death had been, after all, more of a shock than she thought. She would not pretend to be grief-stricken. The breach between her and that indomitable old woman had been a thing of many years standing, and it had grown wider and wider with the years following that day when, descending upon her daughter in Chicago, Mrs. Hawks had learned that the handsome, dashing Gaylord Ravenal had flown. She had been unable to resist her triumphant, "What did I tell you?" It had been the last straw. She had wondered vaguely what sort of conveyance she might hire to carry her to Cold Spring, for she knew no railroad passed through this little river town. But when she descended from her train at this, the last stage, but one in her wearisome journey, there was a little group at the red brick station to meet her. A man came toward her. He turned out to be the Chas K. Bernardo of the Telegram. He was the general manager and press agent, Doc's old job, modernized. "How did you know me?" she had asked, and was startled when he replied, "You look like your ma." Then, before she could recover from this, "But Ellie told me it was you." A rather amazing old lady came toward her. She looked like the ancient ruins of a bisque doll. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes bright, her skin parchment, her hat incredible. "Don't you remember me, Nolly?" she said, and pouted her withered old lips. Then, as Magnolia stared, bewildered, she had chirped like an annoyed cockatoo. "Ellie Chipley Lenore Laverne." "But it isn't possible!" Magnolia had cried. This had appeared to annoy Miss Chipley afresh. "Why not, I'd like to know?" "I've been back with the Cotton Blossom the last 10 years. Your ma advertised in the billboard for a general utility team. My husband answered the ad, giving his name. Not Schulze? Oh, no, dearie. I buried poor Schulze in Douglas, Wyoming, 22 years ago. Yes, indeed. Clyde. She wheeled briskly. Clyde. The man came forward. He was perhaps 50, surely 20 years younger than the erstwhile ingenue lead, a sheepish, grizzled man whose mouth looked as if a drawstring had been pulled out of it, leaving it limp and sprawling. Meet my husband, Mr. Clyde Melhop. This is Nolly. Mrs. Ravenal it is, ain't it? Seems funny, you being married and got a famous daughter and all. Last time I saw you was just a skinny little girl, dark-complected. Well, your ma was hoity-toity with me when she seen it was me the other half of the Melhop General Utility team. Wasn't going to let me stay, would you believe it? Well, she was glad enough to have me in the end. This, Magnolia realized, must be stopped. She met the understanding look of the man, Bernardo. He nodded. I guess you must be pretty tuckered out, Mrs. Ravenal. Now, if you'll just step over to the car there. He indicated an important-looking closed car that stood at the far end of the station platform. Gratefully, Magnolia moved toward it. She was a little impressed with its appearance. Your car? That was thoughtful of you. I was wondering how I'd get. No, ma'am. That ain't mine. I got a little car of my own. But this is your ma's. That is, well, it's yours now, I reckon. He helped her into the back seat with Ellie. He seated himself before the wheel, with Melhop beside him. He turned to her solemnly. I suppose you'd like to go right over to see to view the remains? She's there at Brightweiler's undertaking parlors. I kind of tended to everything like your son-in-law's telegram said. I hope everything will suit you. Of course, if you'd like to go over to the hotel first, I took a room for you, best they had. It's real comfortable. Tomorrow morning, we go to Thebes on the 10:15. The hotel? Cried Magnolia. But I want to sleep on the boat tonight. I want to go back to the boat. It's a good 3/4 of an hour run from here, even in this car. I know it, but I want to stay on the boat tonight. It's for you to say, ma'am. The main business street of the little town was bustling and prosperous looking, where in her childhood Rivertown days the farm wagons and buggies had stood hitched at the curb. She now saw rows of automobiles parked side by side, 5 and 10 cent stores, motion pictures, Piggly Wiggly, popular magazines in the drugstore window. She had thought that everything would be the same. Brightweiler's undertaking parlors, quite a little throng outside. And within, an actual crowd, close packed. They made way respectfully for Bernardo and his party. What is it? Whispered Magnolia. What are all these people here for? What has happened? Your ma was quite a famous person in these parts, Mrs. Ravenal. Up and down the rivers and around, she was quite a character. I've saved the pieces for you in the paper. You don't mean these people? All these people have come here to see? Yes, ma'am, in state. I hope you don't object, ma'am. I wouldn't want to feel I'd done something you wouldn't like. She felt a little faint. I'd like them to go away now. Parthenia Ann Hawks, in her best black silk. Her strong black eyebrows punctuated the implacable old face with a kind of surprised resentment. She had not succumbed to the conqueror without a battle. Magnolia, gazing down upon the stern, waxen features, the competent hands crossed in unwilling submission upon her breast, could read the message of revolt that was stamped even in death upon that strong and terrible brow. Here, I'm the mistress of this craft. You can't do this to me. I'm Parthenia Ann Hawks. Death? Fiddlesticks and nonsense. For others, perhaps, but not for me. Presently, they were driving swiftly out along the smooth asphalt road toward Cold Spring. Ellie Chipley was telling her tale with relish, palpably for the 100th time. 7 o'clock in the evening, or maybe a few minutes past, and her standing in front of the looking-glass in her room doing her hair. Clyde and me, we had the room next to her, forward the last few years on account I used to do for her little ways. Not that she was feeble or like that, but She needed somebody younger to do for her now and then, with the bridling self-consciousness of a girlish 70 as compared to Parthy's 80 and over. Well, I was in the room and just thinking I'd better be making up for the evening show when I hear a funny sound, and then a voice I didn't hardly recognize sort of squeaks, "Ellie, a stroke!" and then a crash. Magnolia was surprised to find herself weeping, not for grief, in almost unwilling admiration of this powerful mind and will that had recognized the enemy even as he stole up on her and struck the blow from behind. "There, there," cooed Ellie Chipley, pleased that her recital had at last moved this handsome, silent woman to proper tears. "There, there." She patted her hand. "Look, Nolly, dear. There's the boat. Seems funny not to see her lighted up for the show this time of night." Magnolia peered through the dusk, a kind of dread in her heart. Would this too be changed beyond recognition? A great white long craft docked at the water's edge. Larger, yes, but much the same. In the gloom, she could just make out the enormous letters painted in black against the white upper deck. End of chapter 18. Read by Kimberly Bonin.
Chapter 19 of Showboat. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by FloraMetrick. Showboat by Edna Ferber. Chapter 19. Kim Ravenel's 10th letter to her mother was the decisive one. It arrived late in May when the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theater was playing Lulu, Mississippi. From where the showboat lay just below the landing, there was enough to indicate that a town was situated nearby. Lulu, Mississippi, in May, was humid and drowsy and dusty and fly-ridden. The Negroes lolled in the shade of their cabins and loafed at the water's edge. Thick-petaled white flowers amidst glossy dark green foliage filled the air with a drugging sweetness, and scarlet-petaled flowers stuck their wicked yellow tongues out at the passerby. Magnolia, on the cotton blossom upper deck that was like a cozy veranda, sat half in the shade and half in the sun and let the moist heat envelop her. The little nervous lines that New York had etched about her eyes and mouth seemed to vanish magically under the languorous touch of the saturant southern air. She was again like the lovely creamy blossom for which she had been named, a little drooping perhaps, a little faded, but magnolia. Ellie Chipley, setting to rights her privileged bedroom on the boat's port side, came to the screen door in cotton morning frock and boudoir cap. The frock was a gay gingham of girlish cut, its color in delicate pink. The cap was a trifle of lace and ribbon. From this frame her withered, life-scarred old mask looked out, almost fascinating in its grotesquerie. "Beats me how you can sit out there in the heat like a lizard or a cat or something and not get a stroke. Will too, one of these fine days." Magnolia, glancing up from the perusal of her letter, stretched her arms above her head luxuriously. "I love it." Ellie Chipley's sharp old eyes snapped at the typewritten sheets of the letter in Magnolia's hand. "Heard from your daughter again, did you?" "Yes. I never seen anybody such a hand at writing letters. You got one about every stand since you started with the boat, seems. I was saying to Clyde only yesterday, I says, what's she fine to write about?" This Magnolia knew was not a mere figure of speech. In some mysterious ways the knowledge had seeped through the Cotton Blossom Company that in these frequent letters between mother and daughter a battle was being waged. They sensed, too, that in the outcome of this battle lay their own future. The erstwhile ingenue now assumed an elaborate carelessness of manner which to the doubting onlooker would forever have decided the question of her dramatic ability. "She got to say? What's she got to say? What?" Here she giggled in shrill falsetto appreciation of her own wit. "What news on the Rialto?" Magnolia glanced down again at the letter. "I think Kim may come down for a few days to visit us in June. with her husband. The ribbons of Ellie's cap trembled. The little withered, well-kept hand in which she still took such pride went to her lips that were working nervously. "You don't say! Well, that'll be nice." After which triumph of simulated casualness, you heard her incautious steps clattering down the stairs and up the aisle to the lesser dressing rooms and bedrooms at the rear of the stage. Magnolia picked up the letter again. Kim hated to write letters. The number that she had written on her mother in the past month testified her perturbation. "Nola, darling, you've just gone gaga, that's all. What do you mean by staying down there in that wretched malarial heat? Now listen to me. We close June 1st. They plan to open in Boston in September, then Philadelphia, Chicago. My contract, of course, doesn't call for the road. Kruger offered me an increase and a house percentage if I'd go when the road season opens. But you know how I hate touring. You're the trooper of this family. Besides, I wouldn't leave Andy. He misses you as much as Ken and I do. If he could talk, he would demand his grandmother's immediate presence. If you aren't in New York by June 3rd, I shall come and get you. I mean this. Ken and I sail on the Olympic June 10th. There's a play in London that Kruger wants me to see for the next season. You know, Casualty. We'll go to Paris, Vienna, Budapest, and back August 1st. Come along or stay in the country with Andy. Nate Freed says he'll settle up your business affairs if that's what's bothering you. What is there to do except sell the old tub or give it away or something and take the next train for New York? Your bookings say Lazar, Mississippi, June 4th, 5th, and 6th. Nate looked it up and reports it's 20 miles from a railroad. Now, Nola, that's just too mad. Come on home. Kim. The hand that held the letter dropped to her lap again. Magnolia lay relaxed in the low deck chair that surveyed through half-closed lids the turgid, swift-flowing stream that led on to Louisiana and the sea. Above the clay banks that rose from the river lay the scrubby little settlement shimmering in the noonday heat. A mule team toiled along the river road, drawing a decrepit cart on whose sagging seat a Negro sat slumped, the rope line slack in his listless hands, his body swaying with the motion of the vehicle. From the cook's galley aft came the yee-yah-yah-yah of Negro laughter. Then a sudden crash of piano, drum, horn, cymbals. The band was rehearsing. The porcine squeal and bleat and grunt of the saxophone. Mississippi blues they were playing. Ort Hanley of the character team sang it in the concert after the show. I got the blues. I said the blues. I got M-I-S. I see S-S-I. I say S-I-P-P-I. Mississippi. I got the Mississippi blues. The heat and the music and the laughter and the squeak of the mule cart up the road blended and made a colorful background against which the woman in the chair viewed the procession of the last 25 years. It had turned out well enough. She had gone on blindly, and it had turned out well enough. Kim was different. Nothing blind about Kim. She had emerged from the cloistral calm of the Chicago convent with her competent mind quite made up. I am going to be an actress. Oh, no, Kim, not you. But Kim had gone about it as she went about everything, clear-headed, thoughtful, deliberate. But actresses were not made in this way, Magnolia argued. Oh, yes, they were. 5 years in stock on Chicago's North Side, a tiny part in musical comedy. Kim decided that she knew nothing. She would go to the National Theater School of Acting in New York and start all over again. Magnolia's vaudeville days were drawing to an end. A middle-aged woman still able to hold her audience, still possessing a haunting kind of melancholy beauty. But more than this was needed to hold one's head above the roaring tide of ragtime, jazz-time youngsters surging now toward the footlights. She had known what it was to be a headliner, but she had never commanded the fantastic figures of the more spectacular acts. She had been thrifty, though, and canny. She easily saw Kim through the National Theater School. The idea of Kim in a school of acting struck her as being absurd, though Kim gravely explained to her its uses. Finally, she took a tiny apartment in New York so that she and Kim might have a home together. Kim worked slavishly, ferociously. The idea of the school did not amuse Magnolia as much as it had at first. Fencing lessons, gymnastic dancing, interpretive dancing, singing lessons, voice placing, French lessons. Are you studying to be an acrobat or a singer or a dancer? I can't make it out. Now, Nola, don't be an old-fashioned frumpy darling. Spend a day at the school and you'll know what I'm getting at. The dancing class, a big, bright, bare room, a phonograph, 10 girls bare-legged, barefooted, dressed in wisps, a sturdy, bare-legged woman teacher in a hard-working green chiffon wisp. They stood in a circle, perhaps 5 feet apart, and jumped on one foot and swung the other leg behind them, and kept this up, alternating right leg and left for 10 minutes. It looked ridiculously simple. Magnolia tried it when she got home and found she couldn't do it at all. Bar work. Make a straight line of that leg. Back, back, stretch, stretch, stretch. Some of it was too precious. The girls in line formation and the green chiffon person facing them saying idiotically and suiting actions to the words. Reach down into the valley, gather handfuls of mist, up, up, facing the sun. Oh, how lovely. The voice class. The instructor, wearing a hat with an imposing facade and clanking with plaques of arts and crafts jewelry, resembled, as she sat at her table fronting the seated semicircle of young men and women, the chairman of a woman's club during the business session of a committee meeting. Her voice was placed. Magnolia, listening and beholding, would not have been surprised to see her remove her voice, an entity, from her throat and hold it up for inspection. It was a thing so artificial, so studied, so manufactured, she articulated carefully and with great elegance. I don't need to go into the wide-open throat today. We will start with the jaw exercises. Down, to the side, rotate. With immense gravity and earnestness, 12 young men and women took hold of their respective jaws and pulled these down, from side to side, around. They showed no embarrassment. Now then, the sound of B. Bub, 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 bub. They bribed Bob with a bib. Sound of T. It isn't a bit hot. Sound of D. Dad did the deed. Sound of N. None of the 9 nuns came at noon. Singing and en masse, they disposed of Bob and Dad and the 9 nuns. Pharynx resonance. Say, clear and free, Miss Ravenal. Miss Ravenal said, clear and free, distinctly. No, 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 not clear and free, but clear and free. Do you see what I mean? Good. Now take it again, Miss Ravenal. Took it again. Clear and free. That's better. Now then, words that differ in the f sound. Mr. Carroll, let us hear your list. Mr. Carroll obliges. Whether, whether, when, whinny, winnow, whither, whither. Why do you spell it with a Y? Miss Rogers, L sounds. Miss Rogers, enormously solemn, faded for Lady Macbeth at the lightest. Level, loyal, lull, lily, lentil, love, lust, liberty, boil, coral. Now then, the nerve vitalizing breath. We'll all stand. Hold the breath. Stretch out arms. Arms in, and in, out, in, head up, mouth open. Shades of Modjeska, Deuce, Rachel, Mrs. Siddons, Bernhardt. Was this the way an actress was made? You wait and see, said Kim grimly. Dancing, singing, fencing, voice, French, 1 year, 2, 3. Magnolia had waited, and she had seen. Kim had had none of those preliminary hardships and terrors and temptations. Then, that are supposed to beset the path of the attractive young woman who would travel the road to theatrical achievement. Her success actually had been instantaneous and sustained. She had been given the part of the daughter of a worldly mother in a new piece by Ford Salter and had taken the play away from the star who did the mother. Her performance had been clear-cut, modern, deft, convincing. She was fresh but finished. She was intelligent, successful, workmanlike, intuitive, vigorous, adaptable. She was almost the first of this new crop of intelligent, successful, deft, workmanlike, intuitive, vigorous, adaptable young women of the theater. There was about her or them nothing of genius, of greatness, of the divine fire. But the dramatic critics of the younger school, who were too late to have seen past genius in its heyday, and for whom the theatrical genius of their day was yet to come, viewed her performance and waxed hysterical, mistaking talent and intelligence and hard work and ambition for something more rare. It became the thing to proclaim each smart young woman of the deuce of her day if she had had a decent feeling for stage tempo, could sustain a character throughout 3 acts, speak the English language intelligibly, cross the stage or sit in a chair naturally. By the time Kim had been 5 years out of the National Theatre School, there were deuces by the dozen, and a Broadway Bernhardt was born at least once a season. These gave invariably what is known as a fine performance. As you stood in the lobby between the acts, smoking your cigarette, you said, "She's giving a fine performance." A fine performance, Magnolia echoed one evening rather irritably, after she and Kim had returned from the opening of a play in which one of Kim's friends was featured. "But she doesn't act. Everything she did and everything she said was right, and I was as carried out of myself as though I was listening to a clock strike. When I go to the theater, I want to care. In the old days, maybe they didn't know so much about tempo and rhythm, but in the audience, strong men wept and women fainted. Now listen, Nola, darling. One of your old days, gals would last about 4 seconds on Broadway. I've heard about Clara Morris and Mrs. Siddons and Modjeska and Bernhardt all my life. If the sentimental old dears were to come back in an all-star revival today, the intelligent modern theater-going audience would walk out on them. The new school actresses went in for the smarter teas, eschewed cocktails, visited the art exhibits, had their portraits painted in the new manner, never were seen at nightclubs, were glimpsed coming out of Scribner's with a thick volume of modern biography, used practically no makeup when in mufti, kept their names out of the New York telephone directory, wore flat-heeled shoes and woolen stockings while walking briskly in Central Park, went to symphony concerts, wore in short figures as glamorous and romantic as a pint of milk. Everything they did on the stage was right. Intelligent, well thought out, and right. Watching them, you knew it was right. Tempo, tone, mood, character, right. As right as an engineering blueprint. Your pulses, as you sat in the theater, were normal. Usually, their 3rd season, you saw them unwisely lunching too often at the Algonquin Round Table and wisecracking with the critics there. The 4th, they took a bit in that new English comedy just until O'Neill should have finished the play he was doing for them. The 5th, they married the little what's-his-name. The 6th, they said mysteriously that they were writing. Kim kept away from the Algonquin, did not attend first nights with the Wolcotts or Brown, had a full-page strike-in picture in Vanity Fair, and married Kenneth Cameron. She went out rarely. Sunday night dinners sometimes, or she had people in, ham a la Queenie part of the cold buffet. Her list of Sunday night guests or engagements read like a roster of the New York Telephone Company's exchanges. Stuyvesant, Beekman, Bleecker, Murray, Rhinelander, Vanderbilt, Jerome, Wadsworth, Tremont. She learned to say, "It's just one of those things." She finished an unfinished sentence with, "I mean," and throwing up of the open palms. Kenneth Cameron. Her marriage with Kenneth Cameron was successful and happy and very nice. Separate bedrooms and those lovely negligees, velvet with Venetian sleeves and square neckline. Excellent friends, nothing sordid. Personal liberty and privacy of thought and action. Those were the things that made for happiness in marriage. Magnolia wondered sometimes, but certainly it was not for her to venture opinion. Her own marriage had been no such glittering example of perfection. Yet she wondered, seeing all this well-ordered and respectful union, if Kim was not, after all, missing something. Wasn't marriage, like life, unstimulating and unprofitable and somewhat empty when too well-ordered and protected and guarded? Wasn't it finer, more splendid, more nourishing when it was like life itself, a mixture of the sordid and the magnificent, of mud and stars, of earth and flowers, of love and hate and laughter and tears and ugliness and beauty and hurt? She was wrong, of course. Ken's manner toward Kim was polite, tender, thoughtful. Kim's manner toward Ken was polite, tender, thoughtful. Are you free next Thursday, dear? The Paynes are having those Russians. It might be rather interesting. Sorry, Ken's voice, soft, light. It was Magnolia never acknowledged this, even to herself, but it was what she called the male interior decorator's voice. You heard it a good deal at teas, at the Algonquin, and in the lobby between the acts on first nights, and in those fascinating shops on Madison Avenue where furniture and old glass and brasses and pictures were shown you by slim young men with delicate hands. I mean, it's just one of those things. There was no Mississippi in Kim. Kim was like the Illinois River of Magnolia's childhood days. Kim's life flowed tranquilly between gentle green-clad shores, orderly, well-regulated, dependable. For the land's sakes, Magnolia Hawks, you're sitting out there yet? Here it's after 3 and nearly dinner time. Ellie Chipley at the screen door. And in the blazing sun, too. You need somebody to look after you worse than your ma did. Ellie was justified, for Magnolia had a headache that night. Kim and Ken arrived unexpectedly together on June 2nd, clattering up to the boat landing in a Scarecrow Ford driven by a stout Negro in khaki pants, puttees, and an army shirt. Kim was breathless but exhilarated. He says he drove in France in 17, and I believe it. Good God, every bolt, screw, bar, nut, curtain, and door in the thing rattled and flapped and opened and fell in and fell out. I've been working like a Swiss bell ringer trying to keep things together there in the back seat. Nola, darling, what do you mean by staying down in this miserable hole all these weeks? Ken, dear, take another aspirin and a pinch of bicarb and lie down a minute. Ken's got a headache from the heat and the awful trip. We're going back tonight, and we sail on the 10th, and Nola, darling, for heaven's sake. They had a talk. The customary 4 o'clock dinner was delayed until nearly 5 because of it. They sat in Magnolia's green-shaded bedroom with its frilled white bedspread and dimity curtains. Rather, Kim and Magnolia sat, and Ken sprawled his lean length on the bed, looking a little yellow and haggard, what with the heat and the headache. And in the cook's galley, and on the stage, and in the little dressing rooms that looked out on the river, and on deck, and in the box office, the company and crew of the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theater lounged and waited, playing pinochle and waited, sewed and napped and read and wondered and waited. You can't mean it, Nola, darling. Flopping up and down these muddy, wretched rivers in this heat. You could be out at the bay with Andy, or in London with Ken and me. Ken, dear, isn't it any better? Or even in New York, in the lovely, airy apartment. It's cooler than... Magnolia sat forward. Listen, Kim, I love it. The rivers, and the people, and the showboat, and the life. I don't know why. It's bred in me, I suppose. Yes, I do know why. Your grandpa died when you were too little to remember him, really. Or you'd know why. Now, if you two are set on going back on the night train, you'll have to listen to me for a minute. I went over things with the lawyer and the banker in Thebes when we took Mama back there. Your grandmother left a fortune. I don't mean a few $1,000s. She left $500,000 made out of this boat in the last 25 years. I'm giving it to you, Kim, and Ken. Refusal, of course, protest, consideration, acquiescence, agreements, acceptance. Ken was sitting up now, pallidly. Kim was lyric. $500,000! Mother! Ken, it means the plays I want, and Ken to produce them. It means I can establish a real American theater in New York. I can do the plays I've always longed to do, Ibsen and Hauptmann and Werfel and Schnitzler and Molnar and Chekhov and Shakespeare even. Ken, we'll call it the American Theater. The American Theater. Magnolia repeated after her thoughtfully and smiled then. The American Theater. She looked a trifle uncomfortable, as one who has heard a good joke and has no one with whom to share it. A loud-tongued bell clanged and reverberated through the showboat's length. Dinner. Kim and Ken pretended not to notice the heat and flies and the molten state of butter. They met everyone from the captain to the cook, from the ingenue lead to the drum. Well, Miss Ravenel, this is Mrs. Cameron, I suppose I should say, an honor. We know all about you, even if you don't know about us. Not one of them had ever seen her. A little tour of the showboat after dinner, Ken, still pale but refreshed by tea, was moved to exclamations of admiration. "Look at that, Kim! Ingenious! Oh, say, we must stay over and see a performance. I'd no idea. And these combination dressing rooms and bedrooms. Hey, well, I'll be damned!" Ellie Chipley was making up in her special dressing room, infinitesimal in size, just off the stage. Her part for tonight was that of a grande dame in plaque, silk, and lace cap and fichu. The play was The Planter's Daughter. She had been rather sniffy in her attitude toward the distinguished visitors. They couldn't patronize her. She applied the rouge to her withered cheeks in little pettish dabs, and leaned critically forward to scrutinize her old mask of a face. What did she see there? Kim wondered, watching her fascinated. "Mother tells me you played Juliet years ago. How marvelous!" Ellie Chipley tossed her head skittishly. "Yes, indeed, played Juliet, and was known as the Western favorite. I wasn't always on a showboat, I promise you." "What a thrill to play Juliet when you were so young. Usually we have to wait until we're 50. Tell me, dear Miss Laverne," elaborately polite and determined to mollify this old harridan, "tell me, who was your Romeo?" And then life laughed at Ellie Chipley, Lenore Laverne on the bills, and at Kim Ravenel, and the institution known as the stage, for Ellie Chipley tapped her cheek thoughtfully with her powder puff, and blinked her old eyes, and screwed up her tremulous old mouth, and pondered, and finally shook her head. "My Romeo? Let me see. Who was my Romeo?" They must go now. "Oh, Nola, darling, 500,000. It's too fantastic. Mother, I can't bear to leave you down in this God-forsaken hole. Flies and Negroes and mud and all this yellow, terrible river that you love more than me. Stand up there, high up, where we can see you as long as possible." The usual crowd was drifting down to the landing as the showboat lights began to glow. Twilight was coming on. On the landing up the riverbank, sauntering down the road, came the Negroes and the hangers-on, the farm-hands, the river-folk, the curious, the idle, the amusement-hungry. Snatches of song, feet shuffling upon the wharf boards, a banjo twanging. They were being taken back to the nearest railroad connection, but not in the Ford that brought them. They sat luxuriously in the car that had been Parthy's, and that was Magnolia's now. "Mother, dearest, you'll be back in New York in October or November at the latest, won't you? Promise me, when the boat closes, you will." Kim was weeping. The car started smoothly. She turned for a last glimpse through her tears. "Oh, Ken, do you think I ought to leave her like this?" "She'll be all right, dear. Look at her. Jove." There stood Magnolia Ravenel on the upper deck of the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theater, silhouetted against the sunset sky and water, tall, erect, indomitable. Her mouth was smiling, but her great eyes were wide and somber. They gazed unwinking across the sunlit waters. One arm was raised in a gesture of farewell. "Isn't she splendid, Ken?" cried Kim through her tears. "There's something about her that's eternal and unconquerable, like the river." A bend in the upper road, a clump of sycamores, the river, the showboat, the straight silent figure were lost to view. End of chapter 19.
End of Showboat by Edna Ferber.